clouds that you see way up in the sky, making circles in the morning sun, flying high in the sky till the day is done. I can't break away. Like a child in his fantasy, punching holes in the walls of reality. All my life I wanted to fly, but I don't have the wings, and I wonder why I can't break away. Oh, well, Mama told me when I was young, stand tall, girl, you're number one. But you can be what you wanna be, but you can't change the course of your destiny. I can't break away. Well, no, I can't break away. I can't break away. No, I can't break away. Ooh, I can't break away.
Greetings, my excellent friend.
I love how every time Napoleon is in the opening credits, Gilly is like, oh, he's here, is he? No. But we're turning over a calendar year, and I have been doing this, and no one's noticed, that every time we kind of turn over the calendar year, I let you know where Napoleon is. So, to that end, there's also now a channel point reward that you can redeem to find out where Napoleon is this week, anytime you want to find out. So if you want to go and click the channel point reward and it says, where's Napoleon? It'll tell you where Napoleon is.
I don't want to see you around here anymore. Beat it. Vous me connaissez, monsieur? Beat it, Buddy. Idiot.
There's where Napoleon is. The interesting thing about Napoleon is that 1791, the first, or we're going to end in 1791. This episode will end in May 1791, but he's only a lieutenant in basically a artillery regiment at the midpoint of 1791. So he goes from that to first consul of France before the end of the decade's out. It's a pretty just astounding rise. But I put that in there because I want to start phasing him in without talking about him too much, because he's not relevant right now. Napoleon in this era of the French Revolution is not relevant. There's going to become a time and a place that I'm going to certainly focus in on him for a little bit, and then we'll leave him alone for a while, and then we're definitely going to come back to him and probably stick with him for a long, long time. But I have been trying to let you guys know every kind of year where the heck's Napoleon, just so you have this idea in the back of your head of, wow, he came from that. So go back a couple episodes, to when we turned over 1790, 1789, and there's a blip in there that says in the opening credits somewhere, this is where Napoleon is right now. And he's also in, obviously, the very first episode because he's one of the most significant figures of the era. But what I want to talk about first, before we get into the whole history thing tonight, is, hey, me and Mads had a really great time on my birthday last week. There you can see the back of her head and kind of the middle right, because we do have a good selfie in front of what this building is. It's Falling Water. It's a Frank Lloyd Wright building that's in the Laurel Highlands of Pennsylvania. We went there to get a selfie in front of the building to send to Perm to troll him, because it's a Frank Lloyd Wright. It's a famous building, and he couldn't be there, so we wanted to make sure that that Perm, we kind of rubbed it in a little bit. But it was a great day. We did this Sunday. The upper pictures here are from Falling Water. Obviously, there's me catching the back of Mads' head, kind of proving to the audience that she was here. But the other picture upper right is the front of the building. If you ever go there, I would seriously suggest that you make your interior tour reservations in advance, and they're about $40 a person. And I understand that this building's not easy to maintain. It sits on top of a freaking waterfall. We were able to tour the exterior of the grounds. But before we did that day, the bottom picture, the more panoramic picture, that is Jumonville Glen, and that is where, in North America, the very first shots of the French and Indian War were fired. And Mads had asked me to take her someplace historic, and Fort Necessity is where everyone takes everybody around here. So what I did is I took her there instead. So the funny thing about this trip is right here is where Jumonville Glen is. You'll see me drawing a green arrow. We can see we made a stop there. And then Falling Waters up here where there's a big state park there called Ohio Pile. But the red arrow is where I live. And this right here is where Mads decided to get a hotel. So I had to drive all this back and forth over and over to get her. But the funnier part was we were all the way down here in Farmington driving up this really scenic route to Ohio Pile. And I said, hey, you know we're really not that far from Maryland. And she goes, how the hell are we not far from Maryland? Because this yellow box down here is Maryland. We were really close to Maryland. But we went on about a 120-mile road trip on Sunday. Had a great time. I was exhausted at the end of it. The day prior, we went down into Pittsburgh, took her down to the point, met up with number 98 and some other friends on the south side of Pittsburgh, kind of just drank in their front yard for a little while, and then went and got dinner at one of the bars on the south side. Then we got out of there and hung out here for a while. So I have this really great picture of Mads basically standing right here in front of the patch wall, which was awesome. But it was a good weekend, and we had a great time. Yeah, it was just good. It was a good time all around. It was relaxing but exhausting at the same time. Like you don't even understand how peaceful Jumonville Glen is. I mean, the silence down there is absolutely deafening. It is. You could sit down there for hours and hear nothing, except for birds and whatever's moving in the woods. It was just great. Mads came out of Jumonville Glen saying it was the happiest, most peaceful she'd felt in a long time, and it's just a really great place. If you're ever out this way, one of the reasons I'm showing you these pictures is, one, it is a historic location. UK Commander Dunbar and U.S. Militia Commander Braddock, along with Washington, ambushed French Colonel Jumonville in that glen. And there he is, number 98. So if you ever make it out this way, the Jumonville Glen is kind of off the beaten path from the Fort Necessity, Braddock's Grave track that is more toward Farmington on that bottom map. But if you ever make it out this way and get up in the Laurel Highlands, I highly suggest you make your way down there. There's not a whole lot in terms of monuments down there. You kind of have to know where you are, but it is worth taking a trip to. Yeah, Jumonville is pretty incredible. It's there's also a Christian retreat center up there and lots of parking, but this is a PA historic site that's right across the street from it. Get down about 400, 500 yards into the woods, and it's really nice countryside up there. And if you ever get the chance, just make your way up there. It's worth your time for sure. But anyway, I'm going to go ahead and erase that because I didn't want to draw over there, and we're going to go ahead and get started with an actual French history thing tonight, huh? So thanks all for stopping in. Before we get rolling tonight, let's see. CF Live and Rocket with the host. Sparky resubbed 10 months on an 8-month streak. Thank you very much. But let's bring our boys back up here and get going after a week off. And I'm kind of going to start doing after a week off. I'm going to go ahead and kind of recap where we were. So don't forget, 2 weeks ago we talked about the nationalization of the Catholic Church, including the civil constitution of the Les Boy. That's pretty good. Let me go back. Let me roll back a second, Terry. Thank you very much. So first, disclaimer. I haven't made a disclaimer in a while. I'm not a historian. I'm just well-read. And speaking of well-read, Gilly spurred me to update the bibliography tonight. So there are 6 new books that I've incorporated knowledge from that require me to give credit to in the bibliography. So there you go. There's the sources. Thank you very much, Gilly. One correction, the last episode 1.9's opening credits, I had the Cordell Yee Club spelled with 2 L's. It is 1 L. Not a big thing, but still like to make sure I get things right when I can. And then, don't forget, last week, or 2 weeks ago, we spoke about the nationalization of the Catholic Church, that big argument about, do we take their property, how much of it do we take, and then the Jacobins organizing over the winter of 1790, and then the right not really knowing what to do in the absence of a center-moderate platform, so they reorganize into the Augustinians, and then the Jacobins really quickly flex because of their committee of correspondence, and then the left breaks up into 2 factions, the Jacobins and the Society of 1789, and then the judicial reform that occurred that summer, and the death of the Parlement. The war powers argument that was had over who would be able to declare war and peace, and then the absolute end of the estates as we rolled into the early part of summer 1790, where nobility and hereditary rights were pretty much abolished, and the civil constitution of the clergy came up and became a thing. Yeah. So.
My lord.
Yes. Cordelia is spelled with one L. Yes. You got it right there. That's exactly how you spell it, Rocket. And it's probably got one L in. I spelled it wrong on my background. Perfect. I will fix that in between because I didn't catch that. Thank you very much. That's gonna bug me the whole stream. Thanks, guys. It is one L, so I will fix that on the graphic as well. So that's where we were as we rolled into the end of June. Thank you very much. The end of June 1790, where in the aftermath of the March on Versailles. In the aftermath of the March on Versailles, which occurred in the fall of 1789, remember all those people got upset and went to Versailles and demanded the king come down and live in Paris. It represented this huge popular triumph of, popular will, mob violence over this absolute, but really not, monarchy. And the institution which best represented that victory, right, was the National Guard. And the National Guard, you'll remember, blossomed out of the storming of the Bastille. It was those mobs being organized by the Paris Commune government that really wasn't a government yet. It was just the Paris electors. But that mob was kind of corralled into the National Guard. And then the National Guard started outright refusing to do things because, hey, those people are a whole lot more like me than you fancy socks-wearing nobles and upper aristocrats and bourgeoisie. But the triumph of the March on Versailles, you find this dichotomy so intriguing, stripping everything out of nobility and monarchy except for the fact of actually having a king. It's going to matter a whole lot less here shortly. Not today, but shortly. But the point that I'm trying to make is, coming out of both of those events, the storming of the Bastille and the March on Versailles, this was a triumph of popular will or mob violence, however you want to look at it, over the establishment, which included the absolute monarchy. And the institution which best represented that was the Guard. And the Guard came to represent a specific form of popular will as we rolled into the fall, where, if you remember, when everyone went to Versailles and the Guard kind of said, hey, we're going and we're willing to march over you, Lafayette, to get there, it was like, whoa. And then remember, Lafayette sends a message up in front of him on a messenger that says, hey, we got a lot of troops coming, intent to be determined. I don't know what they're going to do when they get there. And then you remember, as we rolled into the fall and into the winter of 1790, they passed in the assembly this active, passive citizen distinction where, you had to be a certain age and pay X number of livres in taxes, which basically meant you had to own property. You had to be in this very select group of people to be considered an active citizen. And it was a small percentage of the French, but it wasn't an insignificant percentage of the French. So soon after that distinction was passed, it was ruled that, hey, that's not right. That's already happened. Let's turn that off. But I'll talk about that in a second as well. But it was ruled by the assembly that only active citizens could join the Guard. Dustin, thank you for the resub. 14 months straight at Tier 1. Yeah, for those who have real-time machines, go watch Omega. Last week, he put together a 12-hour stream in my absence on a Saturday with two of his friends. They raised a ton of money. And then last night in Sturf's stream, someone straight up dropped $3,000 for Extra Life and took him to his 900 or 9,000 and change goal to straight up buy one of the CareView monitors, which is outstanding. So yeah, it was holy crap indeed. Someone just straight up dropped $3,000 in there last night, which was stupid. But back to the Guard. Congratulations to you, Omega, by the way. That's and Sturf. Sturf's been supporting him a ton as well. But after the Paris Assembly, the National Assembly made this distinction and said, active, passive citizenships, there's going to be a difference. Hey, I just shook everything. They also decreed that only active citizens could join the National Guard, which, remember, it's not that long ago, like 5 months prior to this, that the Guard was pretty much the Paris mobs. That's who the the originating point of the Guard is, and now all of a sudden you're gone, and only the bourgeoisie pretty much are going to be allowed to be in the National Guard. And the thing is, over the winter of 1789 and 1790, into 1790, the active citizen bourgeoisie and above joined the Guard in droves. I mean, it wasn't like, oh, we don't want to get our hands dirty. No, they joined the Guard. Lots of active citizens joined the Guard. And because of this patriotic display of these active citizens, and you really need to stop hitting whatever I'm hitting on my desk. But because of this patriotic display of these active citizens, there were feasts that just started popping up to celebrate the patriotic showing of the citizenry. That, the unity of the nation that their actions in volunteering for the Guard showed, and, the representation of the ideas that were espoused in the Declaration of the Rights of Man. And the Paris Commune decides, hey, look at all these celebrations that are happening. Maybe we should get on board the bandwagon. Then they decide they should have the biggest and the bestest feast of them all. And the Paris Commune government decides they want to have what's called the Fete de la Fédération on July 4th, 1790. The 1-year anniversary of the fall of the Bastille. Now, last time we covered all the way through spring and into the early summer. We're kind of catching up with what was happening with the Guard and the decision to have the feast, etc., and bringing us into July 1790. So after some hesitation, the 1789ers, Lafayette and Talleyrand and Bailly, they get on board. They decide to back the plan. The Society of 1789 believed that the revolution was winding down, that this was the new status quo, and they were looking for ways to perpetuate this new order for France. And big ceremonies are a great way to celebrate what has happened, but also to start kind of indicating that the events being celebrated are in the past and that the results are the new normal. It's one of the reasons we have days that celebrate all manner of things in the United States, and other countries do as well. We celebrate the anniversaries of major national events to say, hey, this was important, but it's also a distinctive marker in our history, right? And so that's why the Fête de la Fédération was going to be held, because, hey, even though things are kind of still in the air about what's going on in France, we want to give the indication that this is it. This is where we want to stop. At least the 1789ers wanted to stop. Conservatives didn't. I would call the Society of 1789... Okay, so conservatives tough, because no, they're not conservative in the grand scheme of the spectrum of politics in France or even the Assembly. I would call them center-left. They are certainly a centrist faction. You have to understand the Jacobins represent almost the extreme left, right? There's some people still to the left of the Jacobins, but the Jacobins also comprise pretty much left to just left of center. And that's where the 1789ers pick up, where the Jacobins weren't done. The 1789ers didn't have a problem with this whole active-passive citizenship distinction where the Jacobins did, among other things. But that was the big thing. So I wouldn't call them conservative at all. I would just say, hey, they're the centrist party right now. And if one thing has really cemented itself is that what center really is relative to what month and year we're talking about, right? Because there is a period of time where the 1789ers would have been seen as extremely leftist, and that's in the run-up to the Estates General. What they like would have been seen as extremely left-wing at that point in time in history, but now it's in French history. Now, what are we, a year and a half away removed from that? They're the centrist group. And they're not going to be around that long. We'll get to that. But the 1789ers aren't going to hold power for long. And there's going to be another group that kind of swings into the middle and grabs the center. And the Jacobins are going to try to figure out where they are in the left. But we're going to get to all of that. But they're certainly not conservative. There are conservative, anti-revolution, counter-revolutionaries that sit on the far right, like the Augustinians, even though they're not really much of a thing anymore either, that are certainly conservative in comparison. I would declare conservatives at this point in French history to be those who wanted to go back to the way things were under the Ancien regime. And the 1789ers certainly aren't that. They want to lock in where we are right now in the summer of 1790. So the conservatives want the estates and feudalism back. Moderates are good where they're at, and liberals think they haven't done enough yet. That's pretty, and that's a good generalization. Conservatives want to go all the way back. Moderates are good where we are right now, whichever right now we're talking about. And liberals, I would say radicals is the word, not liberals. Liberals is a different thing in the 19th century. Radicals want to go further. So liberals is a totally different idea. We're going to cover liberalism when we get to the Marxism, because then it will get its more modern definition. But if to call someone a liberal at this point in history, it wouldn't be comparative to modern day liberalism. It's just not the same idea. Liberalism in the late 18th century would be more classified by the desire for a constitutional monarchy, representative government. Those are the things that would deem one a liberal at this point in history. But in terms of the 1790 left-right spectrum, it's irrelevant, right? Because there are people in all of these camps that are aiming for representative government. Their means are way different, and whom they think should be represented is different. And that's why liberal's a bad label, because the 1789ers would fit the definition of liberal. They certainly want representative government. The Constitution that they're all working on producing is going to produce a representative body of government. The radicals want more people enfranchised. They want more people enfranchised, and some of them don't want a monarchy at the head of a constitutional monarchy. They want a true republic, but it's still liberal because they still want to work toward a representative government. But what that representative government looks like varies wildly between what is considered centrist right now and what is considered radical leftist right now. So liberal would catch almost everybody, which is why it's kind of a bad term to use. Does that make more sense, I guess? It's too broad of a label to apply to a group that requires such
plonk that follow button.
Precise definition to understand what's currently occurring. Yeah, okay, cool. So, back to the Fete de la Federación and the planning. Obviously, the 1789ers were behind it. They wanted to lock in the current status quo, but the conservatives obviously were opposed to it, right? They didn't want it. They viewed it as a celebration of the destruction of a system that they had rooted their entire lives and identities in, right? It goes into we're planning on this feast, which is going to occur on the heels of you blowing up my hereditary titles and rights, and the estates are pretty much gone now. So conservatives were against it before that happened in June 1790, and now they're like, why would we celebrate this? This is nothing to celebrate. And then radicals. The Jacobins largely opposed it because there were suspicions that Lafayette and the 1789ers were planning some sort of political coup backed by now the fully active citizen National Guard. And there was no plan for a coup, right? But the feast would, and that's what fete means, is feast. And I'm going to say feast because I don't want to say one French word all the time. This feast would invite representatives of guard units from all over France. And they would come to Paris to march in a great procession. And this literally would be tens of thousands of National Guardsmen from all over France. And remember, the Parisian Guard had stood up to Lafayette in the fall of 1789, back when there were sans-culottes, passive citizens in their ranks. But now what would the Guard do? What would they do with a bourgeoisie filled, probably loyal to the ideas of 1789 mindset Guard? If Lafayette did order some sort of military action, because the people that now are in the Guard certainly lined up more with the centrist viewpoint than the Parisian mobs, who used to be the large portion of the Guard, did. Those guardsmen back a year ago were super radical sans-culottes, stormed the Bastille, chopped the dude's head off. And the people who are now in the Guard were much more likely to take orders from Lafayette and follow him. So the preparations for this feast move forward. The Champ de Mars is declared the only suitable site for the feast. And if you're wondering what the Champ de Mars is, it is the place where the Eiffel Tower is today. This big park right here where the Eiffel Tower lives in Paris. That's where the Champ de Mars is. And the Champ de Mars is not something you should just dump out of your brain, because in about 2-3 episodes, it's going to come back and there's going to be something else significant that happens there. About 400,000 people were expected to attend this feast. Evening, Arky. Arky, go back in the VOD. I have it posted, because there are pictures from Falling Water that I showed early on, and I know you'd be interested in that. So, and I also talk about where it is, etc., with a map and everything. So, anyway, sweet indeed. So the Champ de Mars is the only place that's deemed suitable. Yeah, Terry, you're right. The Eiffel Tower wasn't always there. World Fair hadn't happened yet to place that thing there, but that park was there. It's a big open space. And it was the only large enough open space deemed suitable for this big celebration. And 400,000 people were expected to attend it live.
No way!
Yes, way. It is a big feast. And as they progressed, with only a few weeks left to really get everything done, it became really obvious that there was too much work to do, and there were not enough workers to do it. And in one of these rare, and I've talked about tornadoes, right? How the French Revolution is not a hurricane. It's a series of really massive tornadoes. And we're in the lull between those two tornadoes, the first tornado and the next tornado. And this is one of those weird times where Parisians of every single social distinction came out to help the workers finish the job. And it's legitimately genuine display of patriotic solidarity. Artisans worked next to lawyers, and the former nobles worked right next to commoners, and men worked next to women, and the royal family came down to oversee and pitched in. And in the days leading up to the celebration, when these provincial guard units, remember there's tens of thousands of guard members coming, when they came into Paris, they were invited to camp in the Tuileries Palace gardens, and the king would come down and greet them and mingle with them and talk with them. And it's really this moment in the summer of 1790 where it felt just for a second like, here we are. This is the wake of the revolution. Everyone's working together and happy being next to one another, and all these boundaries that used to divide us don't seem to be so divisive anymore. Hold that thought, because it's a moment in history, and it's not going to last. I don't think it's a matter of enjoying the perks of flattering the hierarchy. I think they all wanted this to come off without a hitch, right? This is the celebration of a major event where the people stood up and stormed a bastion of what they perceived to be tyranny. And it led to a domino effect of things that truly changed the shape of Paris for most people for the better. Even if you weren't enfranchised, life for passive citizens, you still had better rights than you had a year ago. I think that realistically, it was truly, in this singular moment, a celebration of a nation. I think it's kind of like there are galvanizing moments in a people's history. If we could go back to 9/11, I mean, I was in the military in 9/11, and I was overseas in 9/11, so my perspective on it's really different than most of yours. But I know what happened at home in the wake of that, where everyone kind of put down their differences for a little while, didn't they? It was this galvanizing moment in the United States' history, where for a little while we were just like, yeah, okay, we'll all work together for a bit. And I really feel like that's what the build up to and the day of the Feast of the Federation was like. Everyone still had their differences, and they didn't all agree on everything, but yeah, in this week or two, it really felt like France was one nation. And as I said, it's not going to last. In the build up to this, we discussed how everybody really wasn't all that excited about doing this in terms of all the clubs, except for the 1789ers. So the morning of July 4th, 1790, it began to rain. Heavily. Like the morning of the feast, it started downpouring. But it didn't keep anybody from coming out. The assembled guard units marched down the streets of Paris toward the Champ de Mars. The guard was joined by the delegates of the National Assembly who marched with them. And when they reached the Champ de Mars, they paraded through hundreds of thousands of onlookers. And the king and the delegates sat together off to one side of this altar that had been erected to signal the unity of this new constitutional order. It's a constitution that hasn't been completed yet, but everyone's supporting this idea of new constitutional government that we don't have written down yet. And this is where the funny part comes in. About 3:30 p.m., Bishop Talleyrand, you'll remember Talleyrand's a bishop, he's the Bishop of Autun still, he conducts a mass. Somehow pulls it off, because Talleyrand's widely known for not knowing how to conduct a Catholic church service, and a benediction. And in the middle of it, Lafayette has to come up to the stage for some aspect of the Mass, and Talleyrand actually tells Lafayette to not make him laugh. And the intent can be perceived multiple ways, but the way I read that historically is, Lafayette, we're 1789ers together, please don't make me laugh, because I don't believe any of this in terms of I'm a bishop of the Catholic Church performing a Mass. He basically didn't want Lafayette to make him giggle. But the best part of this for Talleyrand was that no one knows if he really got the Mass right, because the rain was pounding, and there was this murmur, that cacophony of standard, crowd noise that was going on, and no one could really make out what he was saying anyway. So the Mass concludes. No, he pulls it off, Terry. Talleyrand, in the one area he just stunk at, which was being a member of the clergy, he kind of skates that day. Yeah, what a legend. Excuse me. So after the Mass is over, Lafayette comes to the stage. Yeah, exactly. He's got to try. Under the new rules, he would never have been made bishop. He's not going to be a bishop for much longer anyway. But after the Mass is over, Lafayette comes to the stage, and this was without a doubt. And I've read a lot of Lafayette, and I encourage you to, both from a European and American history perspective, because from 1775 until 1835, he's extremely relevant, except for a 3-year period. He's this hero of two different continents, two worlds, right? He's a hero in the United States. He's a hero in France. He'd fought with the Americans as a young man. He'd finally, come home, and then now he's fighting for the same liberty and freedoms, albeit politically, not, militarily, for his own countrymen. This is the best day of his life. He stands on the stage, the commander of his National Guard. He was a key leader in the ascendant political group of the day. His own values had been enshrined in the Declaration of the Rights of Man, and now he stands in front of hundreds of thousands of his own countrymen, perhaps the most popular and distinguished leader in the country at this specific point in time. About 5 p.m., he mounts a great white horse, turns to the king, and asks for permission from the king and the president of the assembly to administer the great oath to his National Guardsmen. And the great oath is quotable, and I could have done it, but it's basically, we swear to protect the king and constitution, National Assembly, and there's some things in there about we want to make sure that food gets to the people, and it's just kind of a standard defense of people, nation kind of oath. He returns to the stage, administers the oath, which in essence, again, pledged to support the Constitution, the king, the grain, the fraternity of the day. And then he ends his speech and ends his oath, and fireworks crack. They light off into the Paris sky, and the king stands up. And I know you're all going, uh-oh, but he doesn't screw it up. The king stands up, takes his own oath to defend the Constitution. We don't have a Constitution yet, and they're all swearing to defend it. And I've taken oaths to defend the Constitution, and I wouldn't have taken one if I hadn't known what the heck it said. But they're all defending, hey, let's defend the Constitution of France that as of yet is not done. Critically, when the king stands up to make this speech and take an oath, he does not refer to himself as the King of France and Navarre, which Navarre is a tiny portion down by Spain that was also, French Bourbon territory, part of the area that comprised the kingdom. He's not referring to himself as a king of land. He declares himself king of the French, king of the people. And if we've learned anything from the past few episodes, it's that sovereign power derives from the people. And Louis is not stupid, and he recognizes that, and he changes the way he refers to himself. It's an indication that he was leader of a people and not some sovereign over an abstract concept of lands and serfs and lords. And then the queen, she stands up with the Dauphin, which is, remember, the heir, her youngest son, and her youngest son is dressed in a little kid's National Guard uniform. I'm liking everyone involved here more and more. This is too perfect. It is this perfect day, to be fair. But there he is, the Dauphin, being held up by the queen in his little kid's National Guard uniform. Like, he's still tiny, he's still a toddler. and she proclaims that he will be raised on the values of constitutional government. Now, there's a difference between the values of constitutional government and the Constitution of France, but still, there's a whole lot of we love and will defend the Constitution on this day, this Feast of the Federation, and no one knows what it looks like yet. They're not going to know what it looks like for a couple of months still. The celebration ends, and the people of Paris retire to their own cafes and places where they normally go, and they party for about a week. But the day goes off without a hitch, which is astonishing considering everything else we've talked about up to this point. There always seems to be some negative impact of fate that steps in and ruins everything for France at some point, right? We know now, in the hindsight of history, that while this Feast of the Federation appeared in this moment to be this perfectly great moment of solidarity, it was only papering over the cracks that existed. People were on divergent paths, and they wanted revolution to take things in different directions, and those paths were really, really far from over. You have radicals who want to go further and franchise more people. You have conservatives that want to take things back. You have operators outside the nation now in the emigre community, including the Comte d'Artois, who want to do something actively against what's going on here. Yeah, I know I'm going to love Cyberpunk 2077. It's going to be the bomb. I know I'm going to love the Constitution of 1791. It's going to be the bomb. It probably would have worked if someone would have supported it. To be quite fair, the Constitution of 1791, which is the first document that's going to come out in support of, constitutional government in France, probably would have worked if there was anybody interested in making it work. We'll get there. I think you can kind of get the feeling that that Constitution is not going to last because there's a guy named Napoleon out there that's going to come along in a couple of years and not going to have anything to do with that Constitution. He'll be long dead at that point. So after this feast, though, we enter this period where...
I don't want to see you around here anymore. Beat it. Vous me connaissez, monsieur? Beat it, Badi. Idiot.
You're welcome. So after this feast, France enters this period of relative calm where everyone goes through the motions, supporting what they had just celebrated. And in truth, there were very, very few people in that crowd of, 500,000 or better that were truly dedicated to preserving and protecting what had just been celebrated, especially the king. Hey, Doc. Hope you're doing well as well. So even though Louis's up there, right, with his family, playing the role of the public king, right, the public citizen king, working alongside the assembly and swearing to the Constitution, which he doesn't even know all the details of yet, he was personally despondent, right? 10 gift subs, Swagging Bold. Well, let's see. Swagging Bold gets one. Chucksnar, Thwargle, Boycon, Edison, the Pie, K's, BP, what's that? Adit Simon. Yep. For some reason these all reported twice in my log here. Here we go. But thank you very much. Whoever anonymously gift subbed 10 subs, that all goes to support disabled American veterans. And truly appreciate it. We've donated quite a bit of money just through kind of passively going through history and Darkest Dungeon this year. I truly appreciate it. But again, the king was despondent, right? We walk out of the Feast of the Federation, and the king is playing this public role. He's like, yeah, hey, here am I. I'm taking an oath to support the Constitution. But he internally, inside the palace, with his people, his inner circle, he's not happy. And it's primarily because how could you not feel bad for yourself at this point, right? You're the king of France. You are 2 kings removed from the Sun King who built the Palace of Versailles, in which you no longer live because a mob beat down your door and basically told you at gunpoint, move to Paris. Move to Paris where we, the radicals, can keep a better eye on you. You've had your country go bankrupt. You had bad advisors fighting against the efforts to save your nation from bankruptcy, and then you ran into your own judiciary who fought you, and then everything collapsed, and the organization that was supposed to come in and come up with ways to fix it basically revolted against you. There are mobs in the streets beheading people. What's up, BP? You just got a gift sub, by the way, BP. how it's not how do you mismanage. Okay, so Louis is partially responsible, right? His constant waffling, this vacillation where he can't back a horse is certainly a part of the problem. But do you realistically think that every circumstance was his fault? No, there's no way that's true. Louis is a victim at times of circumstances outside of his control. And it all boiled to a head at the Marche de Versailles, where he's now living in the Tuileries Palace, which isn't a bad place to live, but he's basically being held in house arrest by the people of Paris. Yeah, he inherited a ton of problems. Problems that were created by, Louis XIV and earlier. Financial problems that were ignored, everyone saw coming, and then couldn't come up with a way to get around, and those financial problems became the situation we're in now. The falling asleep is definitely his fault. That's true. So the king found himself in this situation that had been largely forced upon him, right? Louis was, in this moment, waiting for the opportunity to go back on everything that he had committed to as soon as the circumstances changed. That's not to say he was out there talking to the monarchs of Europe or his brother who's down in Turin, Italy right now, saying, hey, come rescue me. But he was kind of biding his time, waiting for mistakes, waiting for the revolution to turn on itself, waiting for his opportune moment. He didn't believe in the summer of 1790 what he was raising his hand and pledging an oath to. I have a problem with that. I don't like false representation at all. But he was the king of France, and he wasn't happy with where things had gone. But he also wasn't stupid, and he realizes that if I stood up here and did something publicly to try to prevent this, then that's going to make it worse. While they were celebrating, they should have ran, to be honest. Hey, speaking of running, that's something they're going to contemplate. All right, so conservatives, both inside and outside of France, were also just biding their time, waiting for the revolution to collapse on itself, so all of what happened could be swept aside, and the status quo antebellum, which apparently some people don't know Latin. Status quo means the way things are or the way things were. Antebellum means before war or before conflict. So status quo antebellum means the way things were before all this crap happened. Conservatives all across Europe, both in and outside of France, French conservatives, were waiting for things to just kind of degrade and collapse inside of France, and so they can get things rolling backward, which, if anyone has ever paid attention to history, when things progress in a certain direction and an inch is given, you can never take that inch back. Ever, 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 ever will that work. Yep, as Rocket also just said in chat, that is never going to work. Jacobin radicals were also developing proposals that would take the revolution forward, down the revolutionary road even further, while radical working class Parisians were truly starting to organize themselves politically. And we're going to get into that true first organization here very shortly. And they wanted to flip everything that had happened thus far, these radical, passive citizen Parisians. They still wanted to flip it on its head even further. Make France great again. That should be a hat. So in the summer of 1790, only Lafayette and the Society of 1789 really looked at where things were in this moment and said, hey, this is great. We like this. And they're not a big group, remember? They are just a group of delegates, like-minded, centrist, left-center delegates that said, hey, where we are now is good enough. I like it. No one else agreed with them, but they all just celebrated. 500,000 plus people just celebrated the status quo as it stands right now in July 1790. Even though this was all swirling, right? All this discontent about where things actually are right now is just swirling under the surface, right? Everyone's out there, yay, what a great day, the Feast of the Federation, let's go get drunk. But no one's happy, but they're all glad-handing and smiling. And everything else is just kind of brimming, starting to boil below the surface. But a year's gonna pass before the calm that in this moment no one ever really felt would really be disrupted. It's gonna be another year before the next tornado rolls in. So we've been going for 45 minutes. We're gonna start by looking back again. We have some things we have to cover that weren't able to be slotted in anywhere else. about what happened legislatively. Dr. Death, thank you for the bits. So we're going to kind of go back a little bit and talk about things that happened administratively coming out of the assembly leading up to and into the spring of 1791 to kind of give us that 1 year tour of things. And that's what the rest of this episode is. It's kind of setting the stage for 1791 and into 1792, because these great upheavals aren't going to happen for a year. So we have to kind of track what the assembly was doing very quickly, both had been doing and will be doing, and then what all these groups, right? Because we have groups of people working in different areas. We've got the 1789ers, and we've got the Jacobins, and we've got the about to be official Coeur d'Alene Club, and we've got the emigres. All of these groups are all doing things independently in the wake of the Feast of the Federation. We're going to kind of walk through it very quickly just to set the stage again, because the lulls are boring, to be quite honest, in French history. We want to get to that next tornado so you guys can all start going, holy crap, and then look back 2 episodes and go, what was I saying? That's calm compared to what's happening now. So we're going to warp speed through about a year of what happened in France. Get us a year from now, to May 1791, before the day is done with this episode, so that we are then setting the stage for when we actually have a constitution. And as Gilly said, hey, maybe the king should run for it, because the king's eventually going to try to run for it. Hashtag spoiler alert. Probably in the next episode. So get a drink, stand up, stretch your legs, go to the bathroom. Rocket said it. I was wrong. Rocket said it. You both got blue names, and I look over there, and there's no avatar, so Rocket said it. But anyway, we're going to take a break, get up, get a drink, go to the bathroom, all that stuff. I'll talk to you in a few minutes. Thanks for being here. Thanks for hanging out. Thanks for being interested. Chat's awesomely active tonight, and I really appreciate it. Manny, thank you for the resub as well. As we go to break, I'll let that play, and I will catch you in just a few minutes. Thank you very much. Talk to you in just a few.
Gentlemen, we're history.
Remember to clonk that follow button. Welcome back. Hopefully you all got a drink and stretch your legs. Rocky changes her color after I commented at her. She and Gilly are the same color. Be whatever color you want. It's not going to keep you from messing up. It was a convenient excuse. Before we went on break, we talked about how we had reached this false summit, right? And the idea of a false summit, the title of the episode comes from the idea that you think you're at the top of the mountain, but oh, that's not actually the top of the mountain, right? So we're at this false summit right now where everyone's kind of pretending in this moment that everything is great. And that it's going to kind of be that way for about a year. Everyone's going to kind of pretend that things are okay, even though no one's supporting really the current, status quo, the way things are in this moment. Everyone's going to kind of work in their own direction for the next year. But we're going to start off this next section with looking back and looking forward on what the National Assembly does and the Paris government does over the next period, taking us to this next tornado. Yeah, sound familiar, because it's kind of how things are. So the first thing that happens is this map over here on the new map that was covered up for the first half of the episode. You see how there are now all these brand new districts, and they're called departments in France. We are dropping the old map that used to have the lines for taxes and the lines for judiciary and the lines for where the church was, and all that's going to go away, because probably in one of the best moves that the assembly does, they reorganized France entirely. One of the things that plagued France, right, as we rolled into it, does look so much better. But remember, we've been episode 10, so we've been talking about this for an easy what's 2 hours time? At least 20 hours we've been talking French history. Longer than that, but 20 to 30 hours we've been talking French history. Way back in that first 2 episodes, we talked about the, as Dustin coined it, lines everywhere, lines, and how none of the lines lined up on any of the other lines, and how you could be standing next to your neighbor in France and not be under the same rule set. So these lines that were made up of political and judicial, tariff and taxes, ecclesiastical boundaries that just crisscrossed France, and they ensured that pretty much no two citizens were subject to the same two set of rules. And trying to untangle this mess would require this massive social, financial, religious upheaval. But France was pretty much in the middle of a period of massive social, financial, and religious upheaval, so it was a good time to take a crack at it. After the move to Paris in 1789, so we're talking about November 1789, the National Assembly takes up the question of organizational rationalization in earnest. Like, hey, we should probably do something about how jacked this system is. Like, the boundaries were still there, even though they had taken steps to abolish internal tariffs and redo taxes. They weren't legal until we say they're legal, but still keep paying them, please. The border lines themselves were still this mishmash of crossed wires. And so the first suggestion was that France be divided into 80 square-shaped departments of equal size. Well, look at the map. You can tell that one didn't stick. This proposal was bumped to 81 because France's administrative system works off the number 9 for whatever reason. But, 10 systems tend to be the way the modern world works, but France's system at the time worked off the number 9, and numbers multiplied by and divisible by 9. So, yeah. This would mean dividing France into 81 provinces of equal size, but not necessarily. They should have gone with 7.
No way!
Yes, wait. Would have been luckier. They could use all the luck they get. You're not wrong. But this would mean dividing France into 81 provinces of equal size, but not necessarily equal population, which would contain 9 departments, each comprised of 9 communes, each having an elective assembly to government. And while surely this appeased people with OCD, it was impractical, right? This proposal did not account for areas of different social customs, language, national geographic divisions, which had long been understood to be the natural points of distinction in an area all over France. Like, where's there a river? Where's there hills? Where's there mountains? Those things weren't considered. 81 and 9 sounds like the test question. Five Fist is taking notes. Maybe. I don't know. I don't know what's on the test. You might be right, you might be wrong. There may be a question about this section on the test for sure. Everyone note the proper nouns. It's good to see you again, 5. But this system, right? Let's basically drop a piece of graph paper onto the nation of France and call it done. These natural borders, these mountains, lakes, rivers, the things that generally we use to this day to kind of distinguish different areas of our own cities. These natural distinctive points were part of what was culturally France, and people kind of recognize you can't just ignore those, right? So Mirabeau, we're going to talk a little bit more about Mirabeau later too, but Mirabeau proposed that, hey, while this idea is sound, it needs to account for, square mile people, how many people are in the area, natural borders, linguistic and social groups that already exist. And this was the smarter but much more difficult task than just dropping a grid down on France and calling it done. France and Denmark use huge stones to mark their boundaries to this day. Yes, I know one because a farmer moved one in Denmark, making Denmark bigger. Yes, that was a story last year where a farmer was irritated by the placement of a stone in his pasture field and moved the stone, and it actually was the recognized border point, and it changed the borders of two countries, and everyone got a laugh out of it. But Mirabeau proposes that they go a different way here, based on this idea, but that they have to respect natural boundaries and that they should respect social groups and linguistic areas, and etc. And the National Assembly says, yeah, you're probably right. And they kind of go back to the planning board. One of the goals of this reorganization was to push the heterogeneous subjects of the king, right? They're all broken up in their own little groups all over the countryside. And to make them into homogeneous citizens of France. They want to create this concept of being French over being, from Bordeaux, or being from Gironde, or being from, Alsace or wherever. They want to kind of break up the notion of you belong in your insular little cells, and we're all people that are French. Even if your societal village customs are different from town to town, and hey, maybe because you're out there really close to Germany, you speak German. But they really wanted to break that up. So in February 1790, a new map of 83 departments of roughly the same size, which is the map that's over there on the left, over that way, was drawn up with borders that made more sense. These borders respected the natural boundary of things, like where there's a river, where there's a hill. That's always been the hill that kind of defines things. These new divisions were called departments, not provinces. And the word department is going to be used for a while. Department is still used to this day in France, actually, and this is the origin of it. Hey, you learned something modern about modern France that has its roots in 1790s France. But these new divisions, called departments, will become the core subunit of French administration for the purposes of tax collection, civil and criminal jurisdictions judicially, and even the diocese of the newly reorganized French church would respect these departmental boundaries. So we've gone from a situation in the run-up to the Estates General where this map, if we had overlaid all those maps I had, instead of kind of showing them side by side of all the different lines, you wouldn't have been able to read town names because there were so many, to there are one set of borders that every system respects. And the National Assembly does some bad things and some good things in its history. This is one of the most important things, and it's a civics lesson. It's boring in its own sense, but why does the map of France look like it does today versus how it looked in the 1780s? It's this moment, February 1789, where they create these departments. It's still the basic subunit of the national French government to this day. There would be elective legislative assemblies at every level. Yeah, unified districting. Boring but important. That's an amazing title for this subsection. But they would create legislative assemblies at every level, which would work with the assemblies above and below to assure that every active citizen had a say in lawmaking, which means to carry out those laws equally and uniformly in every corner of the nation. All of the lingering rights and entitlements that were still hanging around that were enjoyed by one of those old generalités, but not the other. Remember those old things, the generalités that were these larger regions, and if depending on when you became part of France, you kept certain rights? Those were all blown away too. No one had specific geographic rights anymore. Those were all gone by this process. So all that nonsense that we sat there and were like, how the heck did France run itself under this system? It's basically all gone now. February 1790. Now, while we can look back and say, this was great, what they did was smart and obviously makes sense, in the moment, we all know that no one likes to lose something that they have, right? We could go back and look at the run-up to the fights with the Parlement, where the conservatives were fighting to hold on to their privilege and the way things were. Well, Grenoble went from being just, one of 13 centers for the Parlements, right? One of 13 centers where you went to seek one of these judicial courts of highest appeal to just one of 83 departmental capitals. So how do you think the people who ran Grenoble felt? I'm not saying that they stood up with their pitchforks immediately, but it had ripple effects where it's a great thing for France. It wasn't a great thing for the major metropolitan centers outside of Paris who were used to being big dogs. They went from being big dogs to still bigger than the other dogs, but there were a whole lot more dogs that mattered in the pen now. All these departmental capitals mattered, whereas they didn't used to. Other areas, though, obviously welcomed it because it elevated them. It elevated them from otherwise being a backwater, where they came into this semi-equal status with these much larger and recognized cosmopolitan areas of France. And I use the word cosmopolitan loosely because there weren't that many big cities yet. But there was a critical omission. And this is the shoe dropping. We talked about how the assemblies at all the levels, right? These legislative assemblies within the departments, they had this, vertical structure, or the one in here talked to the one above it and the one below it, and that's how it worked, right? And you went from city to, I don't have it all worked out, but obviously it rose up to the departmental level. And then the obvious next step from the departmental level is to inform the National Assembly. The relationship between the National Assembly and the departmental assemblies was left to be determined. Mads has entered the chat. Welcome in. Mads, they all saw the back of your head earlier, but as promised, I didn't show the other picture.
I'm the naked power behind the throne.
It's kind of true. Mads punched me a couple times last weekend. She Charlie horsed me once. It was a cheap shot because she couldn't get me to flinch from the other punches. But again, critically, it was left to be determined what this relationship would be between the National Assembly seated in Paris and the departmental assemblies seated in their departmental capitals. And this would be an omission that would come back to bite France down the road. We're not going to say how yet, but just remember that there is no established decreed relationship between all those red dots on your map right now and the red dot in Paris, basically. Next time, good thing, not to say I own them, but if she'd have poked around and, actually, no, she certainly, no. No one ever said no below the belt punches. You're not wrong, but you definitely cheap-shotted me. It's like it was like she took on the heel persona of a wrestler for just a minute, and I was like, oh, that one hurt. So we have this departmental system now, right, where we have assemblies across the board, and city and departmental levels. When the elections for these local and departmental assemblies began to be held over the course of 1790, past the Federation and into the fall, several things became very apparent. The first, there were a ridiculous number of elections being held. In this new system, everyone had to be elected, including judges, mayors, assembly members, and wait for it, even priests. Remember, we talked about how there might have been a problem with people electing Catholic priests if they weren't Catholic. Well, it happened. Where the active citizens, regardless of if they were Jewish or atheist or whatever, or Protestant, they were electing Catholic clergy members. Yeah. This creates a scenario where active citizens have gone from this, I have no say in public office, right? Because it was all venal office and privilege based on who your daddy was. And now they're being asked to weigh in on everything. They're being asked to vote on everything. Who your judge is, who your postman is. Everything was an electable office. And this will lead to electoral fatigue and blanket non-participation down the road. There's going to be a period of time where, citizens, not just active citizens, but citizens are voting, because this distinction isn't going to last that long. But down the road, administrators will be elected to office with only dozens of votes cast for them. What's up, Cy? And that's not the margin of victory. Literally dozens of votes total cast. Because if you were being asked to go to the poll every couple days to vote for your sheriff or your tax collector or your mayor or this seat on your city commune government or this seat in this level of legislative assembly, you'd burn out too. Which is why we kind of group all of our elections on a single day or two in the United States and say, this is the day we're voting for everything. Because electoral fatigue is a thing. Yes, this makes me happier for every 2 to 4 years. I mean, participate in your annual elections for sure. There's plenty of ballot measures that matter. But can you imagine going to asked to vote weekly or bi-monthly, which is what this was? And then the next step past this, right, where we're not to yet, but will be soon, is this dream of political participation will run into the reality wall of political fatigue, apathy, alienation, and fear. This will speed up once having the wrong political opinion or outlook in France will become like literally life-threatening, super dangerous. Like, to be in France, people will prefer to stay home versus put their position down on the ballot box that might not be the position the more violent element of society has. You don't want to go on record saying, I support the thing the guys with the guns and the knives don't like. So we start here with political apathy and fatigue and eventually go into political fear, where you don't want to be publicly on record having the opinion that's not popular. And I'll make the parallel that we live in that society to a degree now where, especially if you're a person of any, quote, meaning, where your track record of what you say 10 years ago can be brought forward to make you pay for it. Where that infers the idea that people's positions cannot be fluid, that once a position is held, it is cemented. And a true intellectual, a true person who's always on the voyage to discover oneself, should have those perspectives ever evolving. So it's the same fear back then that we're going to get to in the next 2 years in France, where having that wrong opinion and having it recorded by ballot can mean you're dead. And people have already shown to get violent when significant disagreement comes up here. Imagine if you didn't vote for the person who represents the most radical position, because Paris was pretty much on the most radical position for most of the revolution. You were actually a moderate. You were a leftist moderate. And you said so. It's okay to say so in 1790. It's not going to be okay to say so in 1793 when the fear rolls in. And this political apathy that is going to start because this new departmental election system is going to fatigue people, is going to turn into straight fear, where people are like, I'm not going. I'd rather not vote and live. It's crazy. Whether we'll go from no representation at all, no enfranchisement at all, to you're super enfranchised but too afraid to vote in less than 3 years. Crazy. The other thing that became really apparent in this system, though, is that while there was this entirely new governmental apparatus in France, the people doing the jobs actually didn't change all that much, right? Because who's the most qualified to be a judge? Probably the judges who used to be the judges, right? We see this turnover a lot as well, where the name recognition factor of, well, who else is going to do the job? I know that name. They've been on the ballot for years. They weren't on the ballot for years in France, but people knew the names. So, of course, new men fired up by the revolution entered the system for the first time, and there were old men turned off by where things had gone, and they withdrew, and a lot of them emigrated. But there were a good group of political officials in the middle who adapted to this really well. Old magistrates from the Parlement stood for and were elected to the new judgeships and the new departments, simply took off their old ceremonial robes and put on the revolutionary cockade and went right back to doing what they were doing, albeit under the new system of laws, the new judicial system, but they went right back to being judges. Nobles stopped using their hereditary titles, which is why I always keep the Marquis de Lafayette's name on there, because Marquis de Lafayette is what people know him as, but Gilbert de Monthier is his name. He's Citizen Monthier right now. He's got a rank, but he's Mr. Monthier. With the wigs and everything, yeah, no, the wigs stick around. The wigs definitely stick around. They were more of a fashion thing of wealth than they were a status thing. The powdered wigs were more certainly a symbol of your affluence than they were your title. So I guess it depends on when. Right now, it's still safe to wear a powdered wig. It's still safe to have that wig on. In a couple years, maybe not so much. Remember, there's already an aura in Paris of the bourgeois looking over their shoulder at the sans-culotte going, I wish one of those guys has the knife that's going for my back in it. So maybe you want to wear it. Depends on what circle you're in. But they're not a designation of rank of any kind. There certainly was that way in the British Army, where certain officers wore powder and certain officers wore, more natural colors depending on rank and age and title. But in France at this time, they were more a symbol of how rich you were, how affluent you were. So that's why you'll see Georges Danton down there, who is absolutely a commoner, wearing a powdered wig, because he eventually elevates to a position that kind of says, hey, you need to fit in a little bit more with your station. But nobles stopped using their hereditary titles after they were suppressed in June 1790 and recast themselves as citizens.
Yes, I'm excited about the beats.
It's so good. It's going to make me laugh. They were simply a known, all of these people, right? These nobles, these former magistrates, these people that used to hold positions, they were a known. And the sentiment was along the lines of, well, of course, who else is going to do this job other than the person who's got years of experience doing the job? And they were elected to a wide array of political and administrative positions they had basically previously held via venal office or noble privilege of inheritance. So while the revolution was this thing that appeared outwardly to be a clean break from the past, it was more of a continuation of the way things had been in terms of people in positions of power and authority during the first few years of constitutional rule. Eventually, the notion of a fair court's going to be a thing of the past. A kangaroo court's going to come along in a couple years where evidence really isn't going to matter. But right now, it looks on paper like a new thing, right? Oh, we just redid the whole system entirely.
Clonk that follow button.
But did you really redo all that much when the same people with the same basic backgrounds and this probably the generally similar political views that they had in 1789 have come along and sat right down in the same seat that has the power they used to have? Yeah, they chose not to use it, right? One further piece of legislative reform that could have occurred here would said, hey, if you remember the Paris, or you remember of your provincial or Paris Parlement, you can't be a judge. Shocker, you're not eligible. That'd have been probably a smart thing to do. But it wasn't done. So therefore, the same people slipped into those same jobs. So we're going to talk about a little bit past this whole departmentalization. And it is a logical reorganization of France. It makes sense. And it was needed, right? We all know it was needed. We know that the lines everywhere are lines thing just wasn't sustainable. It was one of the reasons the regime broke, because it was unmanageable and it was rife with all sorts of corruption. And while this is still corruptible, right? Any system where the few govern the many is going to be rife with corruption. This was, it was kind of a reset to a degree. It wasn't a clean reset, and it took some of the corruption out of the system. But the assembly made moves past this whole departmental realignment that were more in line with the Enlightenment thinking of the time and the stances held by the Society of 1789. Remember lettres de cachet? the ability of the king to simply write down, you are exiled, you go away now, they were abolished. Unjust taxes, like the gobel. Who remembers what the gobel is? Anybody remember what the gobel is? Talked about this in episode 1.2, I think. Anybody remember what the gobel is? Going once. Going twice. The gobel was that salt tax. Remember that the peasants had to pay a certain amount that was decreed, but all manner of people were exempt from it. Taxes like that, the gobel, and taxes that had some tier of privilege were all abolished. And then finally, it was legally decreed forever that all those internal customs barriers, collection points, boundaries, all of it, gone, abolished. But the assembly would also make moves that would alienate the lower classes. More moves, I should say, because they've been making moves since they pretty much declared themselves a national assembly that weren't all that popular with the lower classes, especially out in the provinces, but I should say departments now, because they were this bourgeois class, this Enlightenment class that still thought of the middle as what mattered and not really the lower class. They were looking for enfranchisement of the intellectual, the affluent, the intelligentsia, as I've been reading Russian history lately, this educated university degree bearing class. That's what they cared about. So they were going to do some things that weren't in the best interest of the lower class. Your statement, Gilly, I definitely don't envy the job of the assembly to fix this. To a certain extent, you just can't be aware of the full consequences. But there are members of the assembly that were certainly aware of the complaints of the non-bourgeois members of the Third Estate. And what did they do with those? They threw them away. So you might not be aware of the consequences of some of the things you're doing, but you can certainly pin on the assembly that they should have certainly been aware that they were ignoring certain things. They purposefully chose to ignore those things. And you can't do that and continue to do that and there not be a ramification for doing so. And again, I've been reading Russian history, kind of preparing for the latter half of the 19th century, and at some point, look at how big that group is, and look at how small your group is. So, one of these mistakes, these moves to alienate the lower class, and I'm going to start kind of we're past the estates now, right? We have a bourgeois blended with nobility, upper middle class to upper class, and now we have the sans-culottes and below, who are the peasants, and that's where the line kind of is now. So when I say lower class, I don't mean the Third Estate anymore. I mean the sans-culottes, the day workers, the bakers, the non-educated, they're not degree-holding university types. To a degree, you still have the clergy floating out there too, and who knows where they sit. This clergy, remember, has skewed way to the right because they've been getting pounded since the tithe was abolished. So the assembly examined which feudal dues would actually be eliminated. And we're going to go back to the night of August 4th, 1789. So like a year ago, before the Feast of the Federation, where all that stuff they abolished. Well, the delegates were these private property loving Enlightenment guys, right? And they would end up classifying most of those old feudal obligations and dues from the peasants, the serfs, as private property, which were not subject to the sweeping declarations of August the 4th. What's up, Laser? Good to see you. They would go back and kind of administratively begin to erase very quietly some of the things that they said. We're going to abolish the feudal system, remember, is what the Declaration of August 11th said. But they couldn't walk that back. It was not possible to get the average peasant out in the new departments to understand the difference between the National Assembly completely destroys the feudal apparatus and, oh, by the way, here we are now back in Paris creating the departments. And now we're going to say, a couple of those dues you owed, you still owe. Remember we talked about how there would be a series of attempts to get compensation for the upper class landowners from the people who used to be the serf-bound peasants of their land, and the serfs would just ignore it. This is one of those moments where the assembly's trying to respect the idea of private property, and the peasants are like, No, I don't think so. Feudalism, exactly. If feudalism was dead, like if it was completely destroyed, that was written down in the first page of a preamble of a declaration of, things on August 11th, why am I being told I still owe things? It's exactly that sentiment. But the assembly, again, was comprised primarily of Enlightenment era thinkers. And the value of private property was something that they valued, and they felt that they had robbed these upper middle class and lords who owned rights as property, and they started to try to walk back and say, hey, we're going to try to make sure you get fairly compensated. I don't think it's their old lords at all. I really don't think it had to do with any feeling of owing anybody. It really comes down to Voltaire and Montesquieu, where these guys had read these Enlightenment thinkers in this Enlightenment revolution of thought and said, we took from you. It was for the greater good, obviously, and trust me, when we get to Russia, France is going to be really happy they did this now, because you cannot have people beholden to live and on the same piece of land and work the same job generation after generation after generation and achieve progress economically and industrially. They had to do it. But you had this, the Enlightenment isn't all good. I know I've kind of said, yes, the Enlightenment is a good thing. It certainly is, to the degree it led to people thinking further into the future than they were at the time. But it also breeds things like what we're talking about now, where you have a situation where, did ownership of a person effectively, when you lose that, should you be compensated? What you're effectively paralleling is when the Emancipation Proclamation is made in America in the 1860s, did we owe the Southern slaveholders something? And the answer, duh, is no, right? We didn't owe you anything for freeing people from your yoke. But at the time, it was seen as, we're taking property from you. These people owed you something until the day we told them they didn't. And now we have to make some sort of, we have to rectify that, because the thinking of the time in the late 18th century was that was certainly property. Remember, venal office, a position was considered property because someone bought it. So a lord inherited land that had serfs on it, and those serfs were considered a part of the value of the land. So by freeing them, you diminished the value of the land. How do we make, recompense to that? That is what's important. The analogy to the 19th century United States is huge. You can compare serfdom to slavery pretty much. I mean, sure, it was different in terms of hardship. These people had homes and families they went back to. They weren't under the whip. But the concept of ownership of an individual was there. So Europe had largely abolished slavery to this point, but they, in many, many areas, France, Russia, many places across the Holy Roman Empire, the concept, this feudal concept of lords and serfs existed. And the notion of, you were born in this village, you will die in this village. Your dad was a farmer, you will be a farmer. That was a thing. And so, yes, it's not as abhorrent as the American slave trade or the Haitian slave trade or any of the other Caribbean slave colonies. But the notion of owning a person, and that when that person is liberated, the original owner is owed something, is crazy talk. Absolutely crazy talk. But the assembly, because of their enlightened beliefs in the value of private property, felt the need to find ways to compensate those whose, quote, property had been taken. And so they start to try to walk back. We talked about how they would, when the Declaration of August 11th was made, how they would try over the course of time to institute practices that would engender that compensation back to those who they felt had been wronged by this unjust way, and how over time it would never work. They're doing it now. They're doing it in the spring and into the summer of 1790, and that's why I'm bringing it up, because I had talked about how it would happen. This is their first stab at it. And again, we talked about how the everyday common person who had just been liberated would look at the first page of the Declaration and say, the National Assembly completely destroyed the feudal apparatus. Stop. That's all they read. And realistically, that's what matters. If you're telling me the apparatus, which made me a beholden slave to the land I was born on, is gone, what do I owe anybody? Why can't I pack a bag and head wherever the heck I want right now? Beyond that, the assembly reintroduces the free grain trade. And we've talked about how the grain trade has been a thing that probably needed to happen. This freedom of grain trade, internal free trade of grain, that you pay the market value of wherever you live. But remember, every time they've tried to do it, there's been a famine, or water mills won't turn, or there's been a hailstorm that crushed half the harvest. There's always, yeah, I get it, but for France, it's cursed. Exactly. So they, again, tried to get the grain trade freed completely. And again, this was in line with their Enlightenment thinking. All those Enlightenment thinkers we talked about coming up into the estates. We talked about how all these people had all these positions. And basically everybody but Necker said free the grain trade. But it always blew up in their faces and really made the common people angry. Magical light turn on. Yeah, it's sunset here. So, again, the past on-the-ground experience with the free grain trade led to these roads of inflation and starvation. This earned them, as they tried to free the grain trade again, it earned them quite a bit of ill will from the Parisian mobs, who, remember, were quite literally now able to surround the daily proceedings of the assembly at the menage, the concept of the audience. They didn't have to walk to Versailles anymore. They could wake up, grab a cup of coffee, walk 5 blocks, and park their butts outside the building, because they had these nice big arch windows you could see inside, and yell through. The grain trade gets freed, and these discontented Parisians are showing up, letting them know they're not all that happy about it. Because what they remember every time this has been attempted is, I had to pay more for bread, and people
Rock and stone!
It will work, right? But it's never been given enough time to work, and circumstances have always made it so that everyone backs off from it, because when they've tried to implement it, and it's blown up because of the weather, effectively, politically, to save themselves, they had to go back. I'd rather be hit by a tomato. So, throughout 1790, the Assembly enacts legislation that at times earns them praise from the public, but at other time creates dissatisfaction and enemies who would resent what is being passed down onto them from the delegates. The Assembly was doing what it thought it was best to heal old wounds. And they did heal some old wounds. But they also opened up a few new ones, and what they didn't realize was that mollifying land-owning former lords, because they're not lords anymore, but land-owning former gentrified people up there financially, that's a pretty small group, right? Poking the big mob below you is probably not smart in the climate where the big mob feels pretty powerful. The whole idea is to go back to French history later. This is episode 10. We've been doing this for a couple months now, but welcome in. If you're interested in it, YouTube is in the panel below. You can go watch all the VODs, but we are currently talking 1790 to summer 1790 to summer 1791. So while the National Assembly's doing all this, they're passing some laws that people like, they're reorganizing into the departments, they're upsetting some people with the free grain trade. The city of Paris has been rechristened the Paris Commune, and historically the Paris Commune is probably more important as a phrase at the end of the 19th century, but it is called the Paris Commune now, and I will call it the Paris Commune government because that's what it is. This happened pretty much right after the fall of the Bastille, when the electors, they weren't the government yet, but they organized the mob into the National Guard, and then the king came down in the wake of the Bastille and said, yeah, you're the government now. At that time, they called themselves the Paris Commune government. And they had representatives from at the time, 60 districts of Paris, right? So this commune government basically formed its own city assembly that had, representatives come in from all the 60 different sections, is what they're called, of Paris. And then Sylvain Bailly was, Jean-Sylvain Bailly was the mayor, right? Also, again, recognized by the king in the wake of the Bastille. Bailly also being a delegate of the National Assembly, so he had 2 jobs, just like Lafayette had 2 jobs. But one particular section, and I'm sure you can guess the name of it, pretty much immediately began making it a nuisance of itself, and that was the Cordeliers section of Paris. Residents of this section had played this critical role, right, in the storming of the Bastille. And they went into the fall with the march to Versailles still feeling pretty strong, right? Look at how powerful we are as a group, and here's the National Guard comprised of us. We've been doing this since the Bastille now, and now we're kind of using it to enforce our will. And then what happened? Well, the active passive citizenship distinction was passed, and all these people who felt that they were going to be enfranchised as a part of the revolution now found themselves disenfranchised and out of the guard that they took a little bit of pride in. And it became the situation for the passive citizens, the lower class, where, well, here's the new boss, same as the old boss. They found themselves cast aside into this passive citizen bucket with zero suffrage rights and no place in the National Guard, which a lot of them had been founding members of. And for these people, it looked very much like the promise of the revolution was about to be swept out from under them, and they railed against the commune government, Bailly, Lafayette, and the Society of 1789, because that was the representative group that was ascendant at the time, right? These were the guys in charge, and so they were really mad at them. Jean-Paul Marat, remember, we talked about how he's going to become a super crazy person. He's not he's super crazy, but he's not as super crazy as he's going to get. But in 1790, leading up, in 1789, in the fall leading into the winter, he sets up shop in the Cordeliers, and he was relatively free to publish his increasingly inflammatory and incendiary articles in The Friend of the People, his paper, where he was pretty much the sole editor, publisher, and writer. And he was advocating outright reprisal against those who he saw were cutting the people out of the revolution and betraying it. Now, what does betraying the revolution mean? Well, it depends on who you are, right? Because the 1789ers pretty much think this is it. This is the way the revolution ends, and we're done in 1790. And then you have the people that were ultra-conservative saying, nope, it needed to be over a long time ago. And they have the Jacobins who say, hey, we get it. The active passive citizen thing is pretty stupid, and we want to enfranchise more people, even if they're not that educated. And then you have Marat, who's got his own definition of what the revolution should be, and he says, anybody who doesn't agree with me, pretty much, let's go do something about it. And he's not saying vote them out of office. He's talking about harming them. And this is going into 1790. And in the January 1790, there's the rhetoric that he was spewing against Lafayette directly became so bad that there was a warrant issued for his arrest. And the authorities went into the Cordeliers section of Paris looking for him. And the people of the Cordeliers district were basically like, he's over there. And they would not let the authorities get to him. And the warrant failed to be executed, and Marat slipped into safety. He went into hiding, into this underground. And you'll find that radical revolutionaries, very successful ones historically, have this knack for slipping away and being protected by the people around them. Now, this is one of those moments where you go, what if they had got Marat right now? Well, just remember this moment, because, again, this is January 1790 when Marat slips away from being arrested. We're going to talk about Marat down the road a lot, and imagine if he had been arrested right now. Just remember this moment, because it's one of those what-if moments. Like, what if the Queen had been caught in the crawl space moments? In response to this agitation that's coming out of the Cordeliers, the Paris Commune votes to realign the sections of Paris from 60 to 48 in an attempt to kind of consume the Cordeliers section into other sections, into a larger group, which would muffle them by erasing the section from the map as an autonomous unit. I wonder how that's going to go. Instead of that happening, to kind of foreshadow a little bit, so instead of taking this one section and basically erasing its borders and letting the things around it consume it, all that did was give these guys, Marat, Desmoulins, and Georges Danton, who we're going to do a biography of shortly, not today, but soon, it gave them a wider group of people to work with, right? Because these were magnetic personalities. And how does that work? When you've got, even in the modern sense, someone who has celebrity, people will lay down for them. They will blindly follow them thinking they are right. Yeah, they just exactly what Gilly just said. They probably just turned that into a new, larger Cordelier regardless of what the name was. That is exactly what happens. They just created a new, larger place for these guys to operate out of. So in response to this reorganization, the agitators from within the Cordelier section rallied and formed a political club to keep up the fight. And that was the birth of the Cordelier Club in April 1790. So when I said it's official in the opening credits, that's what I meant. They were working together already, albeit in smaller groups, but now they decided that they were going to organize along the same lines as, hey, the Jacobins are a club and the 1789ers are a club and the Augustinians used to be a club. We're going to have a club that has no power politically. Our power is something else. It was officially called the Society of the Friends of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. And it's that rights of man and of the citizen that's kind of officially, poignant, because we are friends of what was done last summer, where they blew up feudalism and were supposed to give all of you rights. And then look what's happened since then. The guiding principle for the Cordelier Club was to defend the rights in the Declaration of the Rights of Man. Rights which they already saw being eroded by the active-passive citizen distinction, along with the other actions I've already mentioned by the National Assembly and some things that the Paris Commune government did. Did the club misspell their name too? No. Smartass. It's misspelled here and there in my notes too. I'll fix it. Don't worry about it. There's one L in Cordelier. Thank you very much for bringing that up. But again, they formed this and guided themselves on the original Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. And then they again saw those rights being stripped. The Cordelier only required 2 livres as membership dues, which allowed them to scoop up the so-called dregs of society that the 1789ers and even the Jacobins weren't really willing to let in the front door. The club would be led from its inception by the revolutionary giant Georges Danton. So bottom row, second from the right. That big dude. We're going to cover who Georges Danton is soon, because I need to introduce him at the correct time. But he's a big guy. He looked up to Mirabeau, because Mirabeau is a big guy. Mirabeau was disfigured by smallpox. Danton was disfigured by getting kicked in the face by a farm animal twice. So Georges Danton is going to become super important. Like, you could put him up there with Robespierre important. Marat is out there as this, just murder-minded sociopath is the best way to really say who he is. And Desmoulins is going to be a good friend and partner with Danton. But Danton's kind of in charge from the jump. And we're going to rewind the tape a little bit to kind of bring you up to speed on Danton next week. It's not that important for what we're talking about right now. It's more poignant for what we're going to talk about next week. But again, 2 livres, not that much money. It was designed to show you had just enough means to make a contribution, but to pretty much let everybody who wanted to be a part of this power that was not political, come on in. The club saw its propaganda fly from the pens of Marat and Desmoulins. Desmoulins was a gifted writer. Georges Danton was a gifted speaker. He had a photographic memory. He was also dyslexic, so he could remember anything you said. He couldn't read anything you wrote. So he would often say, and Desmoulins would write down what Danton was saying. These men called the Cordelier section the only place in France where true liberty had not been violated. And they started to operate the place kind of like by
that follow button.
Mob rules, right? Imagine how organized crime works, where There's the society of laws that sits above everything, and then there's the mob, which has its own rules of who's a made man and what you can do to certain people. The Cordell Yeet Club kind of operates that way, where they got their own code and their own way of doing things. But we're going to come back to the Cordell Yeet Club. They're there, they're now organized, and they're operating, as opposed to Jean-Paul Marat a year ago publishing a paper because he wanted to say things. There's now a group of people coming together, working collectively, working without political power, agitating. And agitation as a revolutionary tool is repetitive in history as a means to get others to do what you believe they should do. Well, I mean, Lenin did the same thing, right? When we get to Russia, you're going to find out how Lenin basically hijacked the revolution and made it his. There were agitators out there for anarchy. Anarchy in the sense of what anarchy is, not what you think it is. Anarchy does not mean the absence of rules. It means the absence of a ruler and collective work together. It doesn't mean no rules. In monarchy, one ruler. Anarchy, absence of a ruler, get it? But the idea of agitation to foment revolution is something that is consistent for about 200 years. In European politics, where a small group believes they know which way things should go, and they co-opt others through rhetoric and writing to get them to do the thing they think should happen. The Cordell Yeet Club is a great example of that. They are certainly going to lead from the front at times, but they are really good at propagandizing, not propaganda, which is telling falsehoods, but twisting or laying out truths to people that their betters don't want them to know. The Cordell Yeet is very good at that. So we're going to talk about the Jacobins and kind of circle them through the year and get you back up to speed on what's happening with them. Remember, the Jacobins are the only group. They sit to the right of the Cordell Yeet. So back to Gilly's question about what's a liberal. And we said liberal's a bad word. Radical and how radical you are really matters. The Cordell Yeet represents the extreme left, right? There is no one to their left. They want to tear it all down. The Jacobins sit to the right, believe it or not, of the Cordell Yeet. Just to the right, but to the right of the Cordell Yeet group. But they're still to the left of everybody else. And even within the Jacobins, there's going to be schisms. There's going to be further schisms. But still, the Jacobins sit to the left of the 1789ers, and the 1789ers sit to the left of the arch-conservative, reactionary, anti-revolutionaries. But the Cordell Yeet are the only group to sit to the left of the Jacobins. And the Jacobins had taken a bit of a beating from spring 1790 with the defection of the delegates that formed the Society of 1789. Remember, that question of membership was really the thing that did it all in, where the 1789ers were like, why are we letting all these people in who aren't a part of the assembly? And the Jacobins probably correctly said, hey, we should have people who are educated in here. Not just us, not just the voting members of the assembly, but we should have people in here who have an opinion, who can inform opinion, because I don't know, was that the big mistake the Third Estate made by ignoring opinions? And then remember, the Jacobins created the committees of correspondence and created the first de facto political party in France. That policy of letting anyone in who could pay the dues and swear to uphold those three guiding principles meant that the Jacobins wouldn't be down for long in the wake of all those defection of those delegates. And by August 1790, there were 1,200 members of the Paris Jacobin Club. There were 150 affiliate clubs scattered all over France, largely in major urban centers, where the intellectuals of the day came together and discussed things and then fed that back to Paris and to now their departmental assemblies. While they had correspondence, they only heard one side. That is not accurate at all. They certainly sent out to the provinces, or now the departments, marching orders, but the provinces, now departments, sent back in what was going on out there, and it certainly formed the debate. And this is the key thing that was super important, was that the Jacobins were not ignoring the larger population, right? The enlightened members of the 1789ers thought they knew best, right? Because that was kind of what Enlightenment philosophy was at the time. The idea that lettered, educated men who sat back and thought broadly about the problems of the world were best suited to lead people through those problems. And the Jacobins adopted a more granular, nuanced approach where they said, what's actually the problems? People should tell us what the problems are, and then we're going to do something about it. Now, what we're going to do about it is going to be a little insane at times, but they were I guess the analogy that they had a much better finger on the pulse of the people than the 1789ers did is absolutely true. The Corellier Club had their finger on the pulse of Paris, but the Jacobins had their finger on the pulse of France because they were certainly listening, which is why neither of those groups was very happy with, hey, here we are, Feast of the Federation, summer of 1790, and the 1789ers are saying, full stop, this is where we're going to go, and then no further. And the rest of them are going, no, no, no. Part of that's because they didn't feel it was right, and part of that is because they're all looking over their shoulder going, and neither do a bunch of people. They don't think we're done yet. The blend of Enlightenment leadership, like I'm the best person suited with my virtuous notion of the way things should be, is certainly going to come from Robespierre. But it won't be ill-informed. He's going to warp it, but he's not going to stand there like the Third Estate delegates did in the run-up to the Estates General and say, hey, all these agrarian concerns, what do we care about that? No, they're not going to do that. So these 1,200 members, obviously we're not all delegates because there were only about 1,200 supposed to be delegates. Some of them were gone by now because they had quit. But these 1,200 members were obviously not all delegates of the assembly. They were not able to dominate the roll calls and form the dominant voting bloc that they had during this period, but their message was beginning to spread, like what they intended to do, what they wanted to do, was starting to get wide dissemination thanks to their committees of correspondence, because they were getting it in, they were listening to it, their executive committee was considering it, and then what we wanted to do, not just in the assembly at the national level, but now in these departmental assemblies, the Jacobins were able to slither out their tentacles into all of that because there were lots of Jacobins being elected into those departmental and lower offices. The defection of so many liberal nobles to the 1789ers paved the way for speeches and pamphlets without center-left opposition. So there was no moderation to their view anymore because those people had left, right? So it was a lot easier to get things out of the executive committee and into the people's hands all over Paris that was more radically in line with some of the extreme lefter positions of the Jacobins. They advocated things like, I don't know, universal education, opposition to the Catholic Church, equal rights before the law, and even rumblings that France should become a republic and just get rid of the monarchy entirely. Now, the official position of the Jacobins at this time was constitutional monarchy is the way to go, but there was certainly an element inside of them, and again, there's too big for there not to be, positions. Look at the modern Democratic Party in the United States. There's, centrist Democrats, and there's extreme progressive Democrats, and they don't agree on everything. The Jacobins are the same way. You have ultra-radical Jacobins, and you have Jacobins who are saying, hey, just a little bit more, just a little bit further, just a few more things need to be done, but they're all Jacobins. The idea that a republic should be the way a government of France operates, and that means representative legislation, no king, perhaps an executive side, just like the U.S. has in its constitution, but there would be no hereditary monarchy. That notion wasn't widely shared by anybody right now. 1790, 1791, still not a big deal. One single action will change that temperature. We've kind of foreshadowed a little bit because Louis is going to make a break for it. The Jacobins continued to push, though, for this end to the active-passive citizenship distinction where they felt it disenfranchised the majority of the French population, because it did. And it was this position, this single issue, that put them in the same box, basically, as the populist radicals from the Corellier Club. You had a group with no political power, but on-the-ground foot power, saying, hey, this is BS. You've taken and made us lesser people, just like the estates were. You're taking our rights away from us. You're pushing feudal obligations kind of back onto us. And then you have an actual group with some political power, the Jacobins, saying, yeah, that's a problem, and it is a problem. We said the moment it happened, several episodes back, that when active passive citizenship became a thing in the wake of the Bastille and the March on Versailles, there was going to be a problem. It's a problem. So let me figure out where I was. Here we go. So we'll go to the status of the 1789ers. 1789ers, the center middle, right? The ascendant most powerful political group of the day at the time of the Fete of the Federation and moving into the next year. To the right of the Jacobins again sits this Society of 1789, the power party in power right now. They controlled most of the key positions in France. Remember, Lafayette was the National Guard commander. Jean-Sylvain Bailly was the mayor of Paris. 6 of the 8 positions at this time on the Constitutional Writing Committee were held by 1789ers. And over the rest of 1790 and into 1791, almost all of the monthly presidents elected of the assembly were members of the club. Remember, the president is a monthly office in the assembly at this point, where it's elected by the body of its members, and that's the governing officer that decides who can speak, who can't speak, who's out of order, are they following the right procedures, blah, blah, blah. That's the president. And it was dominated by the 1789ers in the same way that the Monarchians had dominated it until, Mounier said, I'm out of here, and didn't move back to Paris with everybody else. The 1789ers were also able to force their way into positions in the royal ministry itself, at least by proxy. There was a decree in 1789 in September stating that delegates of the National Assembly could not dual serve in the ministry of the king. This was designed to keep any one person from having power in both wings of government, the legislature and the executive, at the same time. Now, this decree was a significant blow to Mirabeau, who appears to have been kind of angling for just such an appointment to the ministry while he was a delegate of the assembly. And now Mirabeau is not able to do this openly. He's not able to say, I will serve as minister of whatever to the king while also being the delegate representative of Aix to the assembly. So he quietly offers his services to the royal family as a paid advisor, meaning pay me to give you advice on how to be politically. So he becomes a political operative as his night job, right? He's working in the assembly during the day, voting on things, proposing legislation. Hey, I'm the guy who said we should reorganize all the departments this way. This guy, this Mirabeau. He's that guy, though, right? He's saying, hey, I'm operating as a delegate, but then he becomes a freelance political operative at night and offers to be a paid stooge of the king, effectively. I'm going to be your advisor, which kind of turns into, I'm going to be your advocate. I'm going to be the guy looking out for your interests in the assembly and everywhere else, as long as you pay me. Because remember, Mirabeau had tons of debt. And in early 1790, the king accepts Mirabeau's overtures. He didn't like Mirabeau very much, but he saw the advantage of having an operative. So he was being a double agent for 1789 for the king. He was being a double agent for himself. Yeah, himself. That's the correct answer. If you've paid attention to Mirabeau along the way here, he's not looking out for anybody but himself. So shortly after Mirabeau's offer of being a political advisor is accepted by the king, his debt miraculously disappears. I don't know how it happened, but it went bye-bye. Mirabeau went from being a hugely indebted bad gambler to being debt-free. Mirabeau continued in his public-facing role as advocate and voice for the people, but in the background began working to stabilize and possibly enhance the position of the king, both with his voice, but more importantly with his pen, not under the name Mirabeau. The power of the 1789ers had grown strong enough that by September 1790, they were able to finally force the resignation of the man with 9 lives, Jacques Necker. Necker is gone. Necker has been hanging around since episode 1.2. He's been ping-ponging back into the story here and there. Hey, don't forget we're in debt. He has come back in the story a few times. He is now gone. Jacques Necker should come back into the story at any point in time. He doesn't get killed, so that's to his credit. He survives. He goes back to being a banker. But his resignation, and it was a forced resignation, right? Hey, look, get out of here because we can make worse things happen to you. Wink, wink. I don't know how it happened, but they were able to force his resignation, and he resigns in September 1790. This creates a wave of ministerial reshuffling. It creates an opening. So this is where I said the 1789ers were able to get into the ministry by proxy, because Necker leaving opened up all sorts of ministerial positions, which were able to be filled by close associates of Mirabeau and Bailly and Lafayette. So the 1789ers, even though the delegates themselves do not get their hands into the ministry, their friends do. And 1790 drew to a close. 1789 appeared to be absolutely in the driver's seat, right? They controlled the Guard, the Paris Commune government, the National Assembly, and much of the royal ministry. And as quickly as they had risen to power, remember, this is 1 year. They didn't really start coming to the fore until, the winters of 1790, after the move back from Paris. This is 1 year. And at the end of 1790, they pretty much appear to be in control of things. It's not going to last. Because if we've learned anything, it's that there seems to be a treadmill politically where you were on the left yesterday, that's now the center position, which is going to be the unpopular position very soon. And the 1789ers are in that middle position that the Monarchians were in. Remember the Monarchians a year and a half ago were the center guys? They used to be the left guys. And now where the hell are they? 1790, 1791. Sorry, Rocket. The winter of 1790 into 1791. If I misspoke years, I would hope you can infer the cycle that I meant. But we're at the end of 1790, going into the winter, spring of 1791, and the 1789ers are the dominant party. They are in control of the Guard and the Assembly, and they have reasonable control of the ministry at that point. But again, they're not going to be able to hold on to it. In short order, historically, every member of the Society of 1789, every member, that means Lafayette, Bailly, Talleyrand, Mirabeau, Brissot is going to get a little bit of a longer stay, but every member eventually is either going to end up dead or in exile as an emigre within the next 6 years. But most of them a whole lot sooner than that. So we're going to take a break as we continue to talk about a club for everyone. And we're going to talk about the unreconstituted right and get into the quiz. And the unreconstituted right is, well, there's this extreme anti-revolution, ultra-conservative faction of people that are in Paris, not in Paris, have left, and the Comte d'Artois is one of them. And we're going to talk about him and what the right is doing before we get into the quiz and tie a bow on this episode. So thanks for hanging out. I've got about page and a half, 2 pages of notes left, and we'll get into it, and then we'll kind of foreshadow a little bit into next week, and then we'll go into the quiz, which is only an 8-question quiz tonight, because, again, this is a lull without that much detail, and I've still managed to stretch it into 2 hours. So we'll talk to you in a few minutes. Get up, get a drink. Thank you all, Manny. I forgot to say thanks for the resub at 14 months. Tier 3 is insane. My friend, thank you as always. I'll be right back. Do all those things you're supposed to do when I take a break, and I'll talk to you guys in a few minutes.
Gentlemen, we're history.
Let's rock!
We are back. I clear my throat right in everyone's ear. Just real quick, thanks for hanging out, as always, on a Saturday night. I have been invited to hang out at a Maryland lake house over some weekends coming up, and I think I may shift some episodes to Sunday versus canceling entirely over the weekend as those come up. I don't know what weekends they are yet, but be advised, probably in the month of September, there may be an episode or two that switches to a Sunday, and obviously you all get that brief in advance. But I really appreciate you all being here, hanging out. Chat's been super lively tonight, and I appreciate that as well. And as always, I don't mind the interruptions, so if you're hanging out, say hi, because I like to know who's here as opposed to... Yeah, I will... yeah, Gilly, that was my thought, is... Yeah, I don't want to run into you on a Sunday night. I start at 7, you don't end till 8. We'll certainly coordinate that so that we can kind of switch days. Hi, Cy. Hi, everybody. So we're going to get in the last little bit here. We've been in this whole Club for Everyone portion of the topics for a while now, right? We've been talking about the Cordell Yee Club, and then where the Jacobins were, and then where the 1789 were. I've been progressively going to the right. So we're going to talk about the unreconstituted right, the right that kind of lost their representation in the assembly and their real grasp on any power politically inside of France when the Augustinians kind of said, we were done, we've had enough, we're not going to do this anymore. Remember, in the wake of the loss of hereditary title, they were like, psh, done, or they started boycotting things. Yeah. So many of those conservatives, in the wake of this their political collapse, their total loss of hereditary noble privilege, chose voluntary exile, and they departed France entirely. Remember, this idea, this system of heraldry and title and hereditary privilege defined who they were. It was their identity. It was how they were known, and it was how they knew themselves. So you could look on it and say, well, these are just a bunch of entitled pricks, but when you grow up that way, and there's a parallel to a funny line in Scrubs where Elliot Reed says, you guys never knew what it was like to have all these privileges. It's kind of like that, where you grow up in a system that defines who you are by who your family is. Yeah, and there's this idea that it's blood's important. Who I am is important. And it all gets stripped away really quickly. You tend to not want to be around for that, right? You go from being the comp to something to being, citizen Joe something. It's not what they wanted. So they left in droves. In the wake of everything, many of them headed to turn in Italy, in Sardinia, where the Comte d'Artois had set up his court in exile. Remember, he left pretty much as soon as things went sideways. He was telling everyone else to leave too, but he was one of the first emigres. He was gone fast. And a lot of these emigres followed him. And they would follow him as he moves around, because he's going to move around. He's not going to be welcome in Sardinia for long. But these waves of migration go back to the fall of the Bastille and beforehand, to when everything was pretty much collapsing at the estates and the Women's March on Versailles and into the summer of 1790. Every day along the way, through all of these events, more and more conservative nobles, mostly, were just deciding they had enough.
Remember to clonk that follow button.
They packed up and they attempted to quietly slip over the border, largely with success. Remember, the intendant of Paris wasn't so successful and he lost his head? Not to the guillotine, but he lost his head, and so did his son-in-law, simply for wanting to not be there anymore. And the reason that it had to be done quietly is because exactly that. If you were seen trying to leave France...
Yes, I'm excited about the guillotine.
If you were seen trying to leave France in the middle of the Glorious Revolution, you were stamped instantly as a counter-revolutionary. And remember, the notion of counter-revolutionary plots is still a very big thing in terms of conspiracy theories, and soon to be not so conspiracy theory in France. Yeah, I love how you can hear Ari giggling too. So these guys were just gone, quietly as they could be. Some of these emigres were content to just sit it out, right? They were going to go wherever they were going to go, largely into the Rhineland, which is the Rhine River, Germany. There were all these little principates of the Holy Roman Empire that sat there that, remember, Louis was trying to protect their rights a little bit while back. A lot of them would go there, and they would just sit there, live off the money they had, and just kind of wait it out. They'd be like, well, just see what happens. Others, however, led by the Comte d'Artois, were actively plotting against it. They were actual counter-revolutionaries. And to this end, they did their best to create unrest in France and used the assault on the Catholic Church to great effect. During the formulation of the civil constitution of the clergy in the summer of 1790, the first true counter-revolutionary demonstrations of the revolutionary period in France break out, led by agents of the conservatives. These demonstrations were in the south of France, close to Italy, where agents from the court of the Comte d'Artois could more easily stay in contact with him and his court and coordinate with him from their base in Turin, which is in Sardinia. And they weren't wrong, but when you create a monster, Gilly, when you tell somebody they're a monster for simply wanting to do something, you kind of put them on a path, don't you? These demonstrations that happened, along with a long dormant Protestant population, started to create discontent among the Catholics. D'Artois planned for a large mass uprising all along the south of France. And when word of this planned southern uprising reached his brother, the king, Louis sent orders to his brother to stop it. Said, don't do it. Because the king thought that this would just make a bad situation worse. And he was right. He was right. Because now the supposed counter-revolutionary activities that we think are happening manifest themselves, right? And they give fuel to the engines of people like Marat, who are saying anybody who's against the revolution needs to be not just thrown it, but like purged, handled. There should be reciprocity against these people. Soon to be the Jacobins, yes, but it's still the Cordeliers right now. The Jacobins have this rule against counter-revolutionary threats, right? Be ready to stand up and defend the revolution against counter-revolutionary threats, but their rhetoric isn't anywhere near as incendiary as Marat's is right now. It's going to get there, but it's not there yet. But you're not wrong. The Jacobins as well are going to be able to point to that and say, look what's happening down there. You know, this is why Louis is telling the Comte d'Artois to back off, to not do it. Eventually, the plot was halted. But the only reason it was halted is because the counter-revolutionary agents who were operating were apprehended in Lyon in December 1790 with pretty much detailed descriptions and the plan of the entire conspiracy in their pocket. It provided written proof to the radicals that there was indeed a counter-revolutionary plot underway, and this would surely not be the last attempt. So as we just said, it takes it from the theoretical and makes it real. Sounds like Guy Fawkes, yes, to a degree. So Guy Fawkes, he's referring to the gunpowder plot. You know, remember the 5th of November, that whole poem where Guy Fawkes doesn't succeed, right? But the realization that someone like him could creates a movement, creates momentum behind something. Now, it creates momentum behind it to the positive in that sense. Here, it's going to create a reactionary momentum where the people who don't want that to happen, don't want to revert things in France, are going to be able to point to this thing and say, that right there, that is what we have to fight, and it's real. We're not making it up. Emigres also worked to encourage the other leaders of Europe outside of France to come to their aid and to the rescue of the royal family. Now, there's this large general myth that we kind of dispelled early on in the series where we talked about why were there revolutionary wars. You know, we're not there yet. We're going to get to the Revolutionary War soon, but there is no war on yet. Why did Europe go to war with France? Well, the real reason is because France declared war on them. France goes to war first. The monarchs of France are always portrayed as saying, oh, we've got to swing in there and save the monarchy because we're monarchs too, and we don't want what's going on in France to happen here. That's not accurate. You know, the monarchs of Europe were like, if France collapses, that's a whole bunch of territory that the Prussians and the British and the Italians And the Austrians are going to be able to gobble up from themselves, and the Spanish too, even though the Spanish probably had a greater tie to France than the rest of these nations. So the whole notion of the rest of Europe nobly storms in to save France is nonsense. None of it's true. And we're going to go through some of it here. These emigres bombarded the courts of Europe with pleas for assistance in the form of money, troops, intelligence, sanctuary, and anything else that could be useful, much to the annoyance of the great courts of Europe. In Russia, and I believe it's now Catherine the Great's about to die, and Alexander II is about to become Tsar. Alexander II was scared to death of what was going on in France, and he did open his court up to a lot of these French nobles who needed a place to go. But largely the rest of Europe was like, get away. They didn't want anything to do with it. Wasn't Alexander II a kid at the time? He was in his 20s when he assumed the throne. It's actually, so Catherine the Great will die, and her son Paul will become Tsar for 5 years. And she had been the regent for him, but when he turned 18, she didn't give up the throne. He'll become Tsar, and he'll only last 5 years, and then their son Alexander II, will become Tsar. Russia did have a child Tsar at one point, but it was earlier in the Romanovs. So the period from this point forward till the last Romanov, Nicholas II, they're all adults. They're all adults in terms of at least being 20. I think Alexander becomes Tsar at like 27 or 28, but don't quote me on that. Late 20s for sure. In any event, the point being that these courts were annoyed by the presence of these emigre French nobles more than they were like, hey, come on in, we'll open our doors, with the exception of those principates in the Rhineland, because again, those small little duchies and places, they had a vested interest in their property in France and having it returned to the way things were, so they let these guys in, but not really anywhere else. But these emigres stressed how this revolution was a contagion primed to spread all across Europe. And that was a legitimate concern for the other courts on the continent. Probably not so much Great Britain, Russia, not really the Ottoman Empire, but the Holy Roman Empire for sure. You know, Prussia and Austria. That was a legitimate concern, that this notion of active suffrage and constitutional monarchy could spill over the borders. That was a legitimate thing to press upon from a propagandizing perspective. But for the moment, all the heads of Europe had no intention of getting involved. Even the Holy Roman Emperor, who was brother to Queen Marie Antoinette, had resolved to stay out of it. And then when he died, when Joseph II dies, and Leopold II, who was also Queen Marie Antoinette's brother, they still choose not to get entangled in anything. And Leopold II becomes the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire in September 1790. So you have, again, this notion that these royal families were all really entrenched in the notion of protecting other royal families, and it's not true. You have her brothers who don't want to get involved. All of Europe was still, at this point, looking east to what Catherine the Great was doing and had done, and the fate of Poland. Remember, we talked about how Poland gets chopped up multiple times, the partitioning of Poland. A couple more years now, there will be no Poland, because Prussia, Austria, and Russia keep slicing up pieces and consuming it for themselves. You have to also understand that at this point in time in Russia controls most of Poland. It's created, and parts of Finland too, it's created, constitutional monarchies in those areas, but Russia itself's not a constitutional monarchy at this point, still an absolute monarchy, an absolute, single self-ruling dictatorship for the most part. And everyone in Europe is still very much more concerned about what's going on to their east than to their west in France. They see what's going on in France as chaos, right? Self-destructive chaos, whereas what is Catherine the Great up to? Because Russia had gone through this great modernizing period from Peter the Great and then to Catherine the Great. There was another Tsar or two in between there, but they had greatly modernized Russia. And they had started consuming territory not only to their west, but to their south by taking out the Ottomans and the Persians at certain points, where they had extended themselves all the way down to, the Caspian Sea. That was a much greater concern than France imploding on itself, basically. But so let's go back to chat here. But at the same time, if the Austrians had gotten involved, wouldn't the mob have risen up against cause of the fear that they want to take over against the Austrians, who at this point in time were rumored to have the best land army in Europe? Probably not. I don't think the mob would have risen up against the Austrian army had they invaded. And we're going to get into what happened when the Austrian army crosses the French frontier in about 2 years. And Jacques-Pierre Brissot, who's sitting there in our nice box for the 1789ers, is going to become a warmonger and going to push things towards war and going to get a war declared. And then France is going to realize, holy crap, we're really not all that prepared for war. And the Austrians are going to come over the border. And the people will save the day for France. But that's a conversation for several episodes from now. But the mob itself, the Parisian mobs, are not going to be able to stand up and say, let's go fight Austria. That's not possible. It's going to be more a reorganization of the guard that's going to save the day. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Prussia was still kind of slightly interested in what was going on in France right now, 1790, 1791, but not from the perspective of saving the king and the royal family, but going, hey, how much of their territory can we chip away if things go bad? Because Alsace-Lorraine is basically Germany, right? I mean, and even in the modern sense, it's still a German-speaking area of France. How much territory could they strip away south of the Austrian Netherlands and make that Prussian and not French? The UK had a staunch, no intervention policy whatsoever. We will not get involved in what is going on in continental Europe. And that seems really nice. Until the War of the First Coalition rolls around here shortly, and they get involved, and they become this spearheading nation of all of the wars against revolutionary France and Napoleon for, a generation. But right now, Great Britain's like, nah, we're good. Our policy is don't get involved in the craziness of continental Europe. The only place the emigres, and that's the whole point here, the only place the emigres found any support was, again, in those minor principates and duchies on the French border in the Rhineland, who saw their rights and property being directly attacked by the French Revolution. And this is where eventually the Comte d'Artois found a new home in the wake of the failed counter-revolution of December 1790, when the King of Sardinia said, that's enough, you're out of here, and kicked him out of Turin because he was causing nothing but problems. Because at the end of the day, there is a legitimate king in France looking at what his brother just did and going, no, no, no. And the King of Sardinia is saying, hey, your brother didn't want this. What the heck are you doing? You got to be gone. Because the last thing we want to do is cause, Italy was not Italy at this point. Italy was a division of seriously small kingdoms, which Napoleon will one day conquer. But they don't want the trouble involved of defying France, or holy crap, France's queen is the brother of the Holy Roman Emperor who we have a border with. We don't want to get involved with that either. So they kicked Artois out and send him up into those smaller duchies and principates again along the Rhineland. And that's where we're going to leave things for this week. This is where things are at the midpoint of 1791 as we roll into the summer of 1791, with everyone essentially waiting and seeing, right? They're all plotting. They're all running their own little currents under the surface under the auspice of, everything's peachy keen, and we just had a celebration last year. The Fete de Federation, everyone partied for a week, and everything's great. But they're all working behind the scenes, not quietly, with the exception of the Cordelier Club. They're not being quiet. They're vocal. They're out there demanding recompense for their wrongs right now, publicly. But everyone else is just kind of scheming, waiting. Who's going to make the first mistake? Where's the next rock off the mountaintop of this false summit going to tumble from? That will either push us backwards or cause us to go further up the mountain of the revolution. And we're going to go further up, trust me, not back down. They all were looking to push things to their desired direction, and all the while, no one really outside this society of 1789 was truly working to support the status quo. And it was, again, a small group who didn't have a network of individual clubhouses all over France that, 150,000 strong clubs and 1,200 members in the city. It was just a group of delegates. How long do you think they can hold on to power? It's not going to be very long. So next week, we'll talk about two core Ancien Regime institutions that were basically fraying at the seams in the tumult of everything that has happened so far. And one of those is obviously the church. Yeah, the Jacobins are going to out-network them. Was it a club for everyone about the low cost of admission into Cordelier? Partially. A club for everyone basically meant there is a group that represents everything, right? The Cordelier represents the extreme left radicals, and the Jacobins encompasses the rest of the left, while the 1789ers kind of comprise the middle. And there is no right in the assembly, right? They're all gone. So the right is out into the emigre community plotting externally from France, but there is still a place for your political view everywhere. And that's going to be changing soon, where if you're not in line with the views of who is in power, that will become deadly dangerous. So next week, again, we'll talk about these two last core ancien regime institutions that are just going to die. We're going to take a super wild carriage ride with the royal family when they decide that they're done. They don't want to have anything left to do with what's going on, and what is called the flight to Varennes, which should have been called the flight to somewhere outside of France, but it didn't make it that far because they get caught, and that's not going to look good for the king at all, is it? And then we'll watch as France reacts to their father protector basically saying, I don't want anything to do with you guys anymore, and see what happens after that. Just say it was a hunting trip. They're going to try to do several other things and say things that weren't true in order to save the Constitution, because the Constitution is going to drop pretty close to the king being like, peace. How do you defend the Constitution based on the king when the king doesn't want to be there? That's what we're going to get into next week. The flight to Varennes is another significant event in the French Revolution. It is the beginning of the next tornado. Don't forget about the Champ de Mars, because that's going to come up right after it. It's going to be on the heels of the flight to Varennes. And then we're going to start seeing the Jacobins grab power politically and learn how to hold on to it for a while with the Cordelier at their back. But that's all for next week. This week, we still have a quiz to get to. Yep. People should have left during the celebrations. People would have been too drunk to notice. Maybe. But we'll never know. It is another one of those fantastic what-if questions. Well, where's my quiz button? There's my quiz button. Let me get the quiz questions up, and we'll get rolling here and cap out the episode. Thank you all for hanging out tonight. I know this is an unorthodox episode, right? Because I'm bouncing back and forth. Yes, way. I'm bouncing back and forth around a lot of topics. But it's necessary to set the stage that we understand why Louis is running. And it's actually a really funny story. Louis is going to run, and it's not as simple as they just decide to get in a carriage one day. It's a pretty elaborate scheme. It's pretty funny, actually. So here comes the first question of the quiz for tonight. There are not 10. I think I wrote 8 or 9 questions tonight. What major change was made to the eligibility requirements of the National Guard over the winter of 1789-1790? Active passive citizen. That is not a close enough answer. You must be an active citizen. That is the correct answer. Gilly gets it. The Gillius gets it. You have to be an active citizen, which is ground shaking for all those people that thought they were a part of something, right? Hey, look, one time it worked. Yay! The next question. I'm actually going to qualify this question a bit. Here we go with question number 2. About how many people, non-guard, attended the Fete de la Fédération in person? 400,000 is the correct answer. 400,000 people plus tens of thousands of guards members, plus the royal family and the delegates. It's around 400,000. It's close to 500,000 when you factor in the guard, but 400,000 everyday people showed up for the Feast of the Federation on the Champ de Mars. Again, the Champ de Mars is now the park where the Eiffel Tower is built, but Rocky gets the answer correctly. Rocky says, I'm at 50, I'm good, come catch me. Seeing as how I just answered that one, we'll come back to it. The next question. I should spell that word correctly. Question number 3. Who were the 1789ers finally able to force the resignation of in 1790 in September? Necker. Gilly gets it. Jacques Necker, the Swiss wonder boy, the Protestant, the commoner, who had wiggled his way into the ministry twice, didn't believe in the free grain trade, was a banker, was widely seen to be a guy who was working for his banker friends, but somehow hung on to power because of his popularity, was finally ousted for the very last time in September 1790. The next question. In August 1790, how many Jacobin clubs were there all over France? 150 clubs. That is correct, Gilly. There were about 1,200 members in the Paris Club at that time. And that is a significant thing because we're talking about how well, as Gilly put it, they were good at networking. And they are going to out-network everybody else. Gilly moves one behind Sturf. This one's going to be a long answer, so make sure you take the time to write the answer because you know how particular I am about them. Making sure I spelled this right. I did. What action by the Paris Commune effectively led to the creation of the Cordelier Club? Take your time. Act of past and citizenship was passed, and the citizens are disenfranchised. Seeing the assembly cast them aside, the promise of revolution had failed for them. Nope, that is not what the Paris Commune did. That is why they were mad, but that is not what the Paris Commune did that created the club. You had the entire premise of it correct during the section in which we discussed it. Redistricting of Paris to try to gobble up the Cordelier into other districts. Instead, Cordeliers take over of the new larger district they were part of. That's the answer. And to organize that new larger district, they create the Cordelier Club. Making sure that the name lived on. Gilly gets it again and moves into a tie with Sturf. All right. Pay attention to the wording of this question. How many departments were created when France was finally administratively reorganized? My verbose notes helped me out on this one. 83. Yes, there were 83 districts at the final end of the reorganization of France. Remember, they originally wanted to do it based on the number 9, and it didn't work out, and it became, at the end of it all the lines are broken down, and we create 83 departments. That is the correct answer, and Gilly gets it. Moving into sole possession of second place. And the last question, the question that I kept off because I already answered it really recently. Where was the main ceremony of the Fete de la Fédération held? Champ de Mars. Rocket gets it. It's Champs, C-H-A-M-P-S de Mars. So it'd be spelled like this. But Rocket gets it. And Rocket moves to 51, which is my lucky number. Gilly is at 15, passing Sturf tonight. Everyone else getting dusted. And that will be the end of things this evening.
Let's rock!
So thank you all for hanging out, as always. We'll get this back up to cover up the whiteboard. The whiteboard is not going to budge. Those names are going to be important for a while. We didn't bring the Comte d'Artois down because he's already up on the emigre board. We know he's the brother of the king. But yeah,
I don't want to see you around here anymore. Beat it!
I have one change to make. You're not wrong. I got to fix the Cordelier Club, which will be easy. I have it saved as a template, so it's a simple thing to do, but I will fix it. But that'll be the episode for tonight. I really appreciate you all coming and hanging out, wanting to learn. Chat was much more active than usual tonight, which I also appreciate. Ton of people lurking. Seriously, all of you. I see it.
I'm excited.
I see the long list of names lurking as Gilly's head goes flying. And I really appreciate you hanging out just to hear and just to learn and see the conversation and pick up some history. Again, this was discussed yesterday, I think, in Gilly's stream, is what's the flow here? And I have adjusted the flow a little bit. We're going to be in French Revolution for a while. Simply because 7 to 7, what's up, man? Good to see you. We're going to be French Revolution for a while, which naturally transitions to Napoleon all the way up to the Treaty of Vienna, right? And then we're going to get into the July Revolution, which puts the Bourbons back on the throne. I've called that the Bourbon
Remember
Restoration
to
of the
clonk
past.
that follow
And then we're
button.
going to get into the revolutions of 1730, which changes who's on the French throne. And then we're going to go to the revolutions of 1848, which is the continent-wide uprising, which Russia rolls in and goes, no more of that. But that begins the rise of concepts like Marxism and anarchism and other things. We'll roll into probably Russian history as a focus for a while because it's a great segue into the Russo-Japanese War, the Revolution of 1905, and then we're going to kind of put the Russians in with everybody else and say, here's World War I. Along the way, we'll talk about the Franco-Prussian War and the formation of the Germany as a country, but this is all going to kind of flow into this one kind of general period in the late 19th century. And then after World War I, we're going to get into what's called the interbellum, or the between era of the two wars. I consider World War I and World War II to be one conflict rooted in one problem, manifested in different ways. And then we'll branch into the Cold War. We've got years of content here. The French Revolution is going to take me into the late fall or early winter. It's going to get crazy here shortly when we get to this next section, and tornadoes are going to come more often. But I really do appreciate you being here. Lurking is great. Yeah, I can see it, and I can tell people are hanging out and enjoying themselves. Dr. Death, thank you very much. 14 months at Tier 3 along with Manny. That's crazy. Again, all Tier 1 sub revenue along with bits and stream loose cards. And if you haven't picked up that pack tonight, go for that. All goes to disabled American veterans. We're having an impact there, and I'm still campaigning them to get on Tiltify so we can actually get a progress bar and, say this is how much money we've raised. That's the link right there. You can do things in chat that make a card pop up right on that chat bar below me and cause havoc sometimes right in the middle of me speaking. But that's enough for me tonight. Let's go have a look at who is out there streaming, and then we will go drop someone a raid. So let me see who those people are going to be. I will take suggestions. I see Slackadelics playing Back for Blood, which is a co-op zombie shooter. I don't see any of the other educational streamers I follow going right now. Below me. No one? All right, you know what? We'll drop it on Slack because we haven't rated Slack in a long time. I'll go ahead and mute that and hang out with him. Don't hang out with him, but give him 10 minutes of your time and see if you enjoy what he's doing. Civils. Yeah, I did raid Civil a few streams ago. So we're going to get out of here. So we'll do our normal thing on the way out the door. There's Dustin. Make sure you hang out with him Saturday.
It is time.
It's Monday through Saturday at
Your
7:30 in the morning.
is
Thank you very much, Gilly. There's Permadube coming back from Permacation next Monday. I know we've all missed him. Be there at 10 a.m. when he comes back on. You're welcome, Rocket. Thanks for being here. There's the Gilius. Weeknights, including tomorrow night, starting at about 6 p.m. He just beat Sigrun on Give Me God Award difficulty, which is the source of that new Scream for the Guillotine. Laser, thanks for hanging out tonight. There's Rocket Tuesday, Thursdays, and Saturdays. She was playing Persona 5 today. I lurked it while I was getting other stuff done because it's too weird for me to pay attention to. Sturfers, who has been huge in supporting Omega this year, getting that extra life goal to the goal of getting one care stream monitor bought for Beaumont Children's Hospitals, NICU, and there is the man himself, Omega, Tuesdays and Thursdays, and sometimes on Saturdays doing fundraising for extra life. We're out of here. We will talk to you next week for episode 1.11 as Louis heads out of France. Later, everybody.
Be excellent to each other.